definition because that doesn't help me. A mass, especially Catholic, to honor and
3 places. 3 times she was shown the door. Not because she'd done anything wrong, not because she was lazy or incapable, but because each time someone saw the burn scar running from her neck down to her left shoulder, the lasting mark of the fire that took her parents when she was 9 years old, they turned away at once. The restaurant owner said her appearance would hurt the image for high-end customers. The hotel manager paid her for exactly 1 day, then set the money on the table instead of placing it in her hand, as if touching her meant touching something filthy. The bar manager was drunk, tugged at her blouse, and laughed at the scar with the crudest words a man can throw at a woman. Eloise Crawford, 27 years old, sat on a sidewalk bench at 2 a.m. in the town of Ashford, Montana, counting every last bill left in her wallet, enough to survive 4 more days, not enough to buy a bus ticket out of town. She was stuck. She was close to giving up. And in her head, the orphanage director's voice from when she was 18 rang out as clearly as if the woman were standing right in front of her. "No one will want to keep you, Eloise. You should get used to that." But then the owner of a small diner slipped her a scrap of paper with an address and said, "There's someone who needs a housekeeper. The pay is high, but no one dares to take it." That someone was Beckett Moreau, the boss who controlled half of Ashford, the man the whole town bowed to when they heard his name, the man who'd lost his wife 4 years earlier and had lived like an emotionless machine ever since, inside a cold mansion deep in the woods. Ellie went to meet him, pulled down her collar to show the scar, and said, "3 places before this fired me because of this. If you have a problem with it too, say so now." Beckett looked at the scar, then he looked straight into her eyes, and he asked a question no one in those 3 places had bothered to ask. But that still wasn't the question that changed everything. That question came later, the question that in all 27 years of her life no one had ever asked her, and when it was spoken, Eloise Crawford cried. Not from pain, but because for the first time, someone truly saw her. If this story touched your heart, please hit like so more people can hear it. Please share it with someone you believe needs to be reminded that they're worthy of being loved. And if you don't want to miss stories like this, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications right now. The next morning, Eloise Crawford stood in front of the iron gates of the Moreau estate at exactly 6 o'clock, while early morning mist still lay white over the Montana pines. The gates opened automatically, without a human voice, without a greeting, only the soft mechanical hum of security cameras turning to follow her steps along the stone path leading inside. The mansion emerged in the dawn light like a flawless sculpture. Gray stone walls, steep roof lines, tall windows, grounds so vast that Ellie could hear the wind threading through the empty spaces between the walls. It was beautiful, undeniably so. Yet the house had no soul. Not a single flower by the porch. No curtains on any window. Morning light poured inside and found nothing to hold it, passing straight through and vanishing, as if the house itself rejected sunlight. Franklin Doyle opened the door for her, the same expressionless face as the day before, the same eyes scanning her from head to toe without a word. He led her down a long corridor, pointing out the kitchen, the laundry room, the living room, each place accompanied by a short sentence delivered like a military order. Then he stopped in front of the library, where the oak door stood slightly ajar, and said in a low, slow voice, each word precise, "Don't go into the basement. Don't ask about Mr. Moreau's business. Don't open the door to anyone unless he or I give permission. Don't speak to anyone who asks about him." Ellie nodded. She didn't ask why. She'd lived long enough in this world to know there were questions you didn't ask if you wanted to survive. She stepped into the kitchen, opened the cabinets, and found emptiness staring back at her. Black coffee, whiskey, a box of salt, a packet of pasta that had expired 3 months earlier. Nothing else. The kitchen cupboards told her more than anyone else in that house ever could, telling her that the man who lived here had stopped taking care of himself a long time ago. Ellie made breakfast with what she could find. Eggs from a nearly empty refrigerator, bread she'd brought with her from Pearl's diner, coffee brewed properly instead of the clumped instant powder sitting forgotten in its tin. Beckett came down the stairs at 7, sat at the table, didn't look at her, didn't greet her, didn't say a word. He finished everything. He stood up. He left. The entire first breakfast passed in 4 minutes of silence. The only sound the clink of fork against plate. Ellie washed the dishes and began cleaning. She passed by the library, the door open, and she saw it. a small photograph in a silver frame, set on the mantel. The woman in the photo had long black hair, a wide smile, eyes so bright they seemed to be looking straight at Ellie. She was beautiful in a way that made it impossible to look away. A beauty with depth, with weight, with a story behind it. Ellie stood there longer than necessary, wondering who the woman was. But she didn't ask, because Franklin had made the rules clear, and because the eyes in that photograph carried the very light this mansion was missing. The first weeks passed in a repeating rhythm. Ellie cooked 3 meals a day. Beckett ate in silence, sometimes sitting for only 5 minutes before leaving, sometimes not appearing at all. He spoke to her an average of no more than 5 sentences a day, most of them limited to fine, no need, and leave it. But Ellie began to notice the small things Beckett never said out loud. One cold morning, she opened her bedroom door and found a neatly folded wool blanket placed right at the threshold. No note, no message. No one claimed to have left it there. She asked Franklin, and Franklin looked away and said, "I don't know." But the night before, Ellie had heard heavy footsteps stop outside her door and then move on, and she knew they didn't belong to Franklin. She began to experiment in the kitchen, cooking dishes she learned from books borrowed at the town library, meals she'd never dared to make before because there'd been no one to cook for. Some days she ruined everything. Sauces burnt bitter, cakes collapsing in on themselves. But Beckett still ate it all. Every time. No complaints. No leftovers. She didn't know if it was polite habit, or something else entirely, but she remembered it. Then one night, around 2 a.m, Ellie woke up thirsty. She went downstairs and heard Beckett speaking in his library. The door partly closed, the desk lamp casting a thin strip of yellow light across the dark wooden floor. His voice was cold as steel, slow, each word falling heavy like stone. "If he touches my shipment one more time, I'll cut off each of his fingers and send them to his wife, and tell him it's a polite message." Ellie froze in the hallway shadows, her hand trembling around her glass of water. She closed her eyes. She reminded herself, this was Beckett Moreau, the boss the entire town of Ashford bowed to, the man no one dared work for, the man Pearl had reassured her was not a monster. In that moment, standing in the dark hallway of the luxurious mansion, Ellie wanted to run, but she'd been running her entire life. She returned to her room, lay down, closed her eyes, and told herself she'd decide in the morning. Morning came. Ellie made oatmeal with honey, something she'd never cooked before, a recipe she'd skimmed from an old cookbook she'd found on the kitchen shelf. She carried the bowl to the table, set it down, and prepared to retreat to the kitchen to eat alone as usual. Beckett sat down, took a spoonful, tasted it, then looked up. For the first time in 3 weeks, he looked straight into her eyes. "The oatmeal's good today." 3 words. Just 3. But the way he said them, slow and deliberate, as if each word had to push through some invisible wall inside him before escaping, made Ellie stand still. She nodded, turned back toward the kitchen, and smiled. That smile stayed with her all morning, as she wiped the tables, as she folded laundry, as she stood by the window looking out at the pine forest and, for the first time, didn't feel like she was living in a stranger's home. The rain slammed down on Ashford on Thursday afternoon of the 4th week. The kind of Montana rain that gives no warning. A sky that had been clear turning charcoal in 10 minutes, then spilling water as if someone had tipped an entire ocean upside down onto the heavens. Ellie was hanging tablecloths in the backyard when she heard a cry. Not a human cry. Smaller, weaker, the sort of sound most people would mistake for wind or ignore entirely. But Ellie wasn't most people. She'd once been the child who cried for help and no one heard, so she recognized a plea anywhere, in any living thing. She found it beneath a scrubby wild bush near the fence on the east side of the garden. A stray cat with dirty gray fur, so thin its ribs showed through the wet coat plastered to its body, its right front leg broken, bent at such a wrong angle that looking at it hurt. The cat lay curled in on itself, eyes wide, trembling, and when Ellie crouched down, it screamed and swiped at the air, claws slicing less than a centimeter from her hand. Ellie didn't pull back. She sat down, right there in the mud, under the rain, and didn't move. She knew that wounded creatures don't need someone who rushes in to save them. They need someone who will sit still long enough for them to understand this person won't add more pain. Rain pounded her head, soaked through her clothes, ran down her spine, but she didn't stand. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. The cat stopped screaming. 20 minutes later, it lay still, yellow eyes locked on her, still afraid but no longer striking. Ellie slowly offered her hand, palm down and the back of her hand turned up toward the sky. Not clenched, not reaching, just placed there and waiting. The cat sniffed. Then it dropped its head onto her hand, as if surrendering, not because it trusted her, but because it was too exhausted to keep fighting. Ellie carried it into the kitchen, drenched from head to toe, rainwater dripping onto the clean tile floor she'd mopped that morning. She set the cat on a terry cloth towel folded into quarters, then rummaged in a drawer for 2 wooden chopsticks and found a roll of gauze from the small first aid box in the first floor bathroom. She splinted the cat's leg with the 2 chopsticks, wrapped the gauze around them, gentle and unhurried, her mouth humming a lullaby so softly she couldn't remember who had taught it to her. Maybe her mother, maybe someone in the orphanage, maybe no one at all, and she'd simply sung it to herself through the long sleepless nights of childhood. The cat made a small, pained sound, but didn't scratch. Blood from the wound smeared her fingers, mixing with the rainwater, but she didn't stop. She didn't hear the footsteps behind her. Beckett Moreau stood in the kitchen doorway, car keys still in his hand, his coat not yet removed, and he watched her. He watched a girl with wet hair stuck to her forehead, sitting on the floor of a $1 million kitchen, cat blood on her hands, singing a lullaby to a wild creature most people would step over without a second glance. How long he'd been there, Ellie didn't know. When she finally looked up, he was already standing in the doorway, and his face held something she hadn't seen once in 4 weeks in this house. Not cold, not empty, but something softer, deeper, something trying to rise from beneath the ice he'd built around himself. He didn't speak. He turned away, and Ellie thought he would disappear upstairs like always. But 2 minutes later, he came back. In his hand was a veterinary first aid kit, a specialized one, with sterile gauze, antiseptic, a small splint, everything Ellie's 2 wooden chopsticks couldn't replace, and in his other hand, a bowl of warm milk. He set both down on the floor beside her, then sat down. Beckett Moreau, the mafia boss who controlled half of Ashford, the man who only last night had ordered someone's fingers cut off over the phone, was now sitting on the kitchen floor beside a housekeeper with a burn scar, holding a broken stray cat steady while she wrapped a proper splint into place. His hands were large, rough, hands Ellie knew had done things she didn't want to imagine. Yet in that moment, they were so gentle the cat didn't even flinch. He held the tiny leg between 2 fingers, steady but not squeezing, as if he understood exactly how much pressure was enough to hold without hurting. They didn't speak through any of it, only the rain on the roof, the cat's quiet breathing, and the soft rasp of medical gauze as Ellie wound it around the new splint. When she finished, Ellie set the bowl of milk in front of the cat, and it began to lap, slowly, weakly, but alive. Beckett stayed beside her on the floor, his back against the cabinet, his eyes on the cat. Then he said, his voice so low Ellie almost didn't hear it, "My wife used to pick up stray cats too." Ellie turned to look at him. He didn't look back. He was looking at the cat, but his eyes weren't seeing the cat. His eyes were seeing something far away, in another place, another time, where the black-haired woman in the photograph in the library had sat on a kitchen floor like this, had held a stray cat like this, had hummed like this. She picked up everything that was abandoned, he continued, his voice rougher, as if each word had to pass through something painful in his chest before it could reach his mouth. Cats, dogs, nestlings that had fallen out of their nests. She said no one had the right to decide what was worth saving. Then he stood up, suddenly, fast, as if he'd realized he'd said too much. He walked away without looking back, heavy footsteps in the hallway, then the sound of the library door closing. But before he turned his back, Ellie had seen it. His eyes were red. Beckett Moreau, the man all of Ashford feared, had nearly cried on the kitchen floor over a stray cat and the memory of his dead wife. Ellie stayed where she was, alone on the floor, the cat curled on her lap, the rain outside the door beginning to soften. She looked down at the dirty gray fur, at the broken leg now temporarily splinted, at the small creature the whole world had thrown away, now sleeping quietly in her arms, and she gave it a name. Ashes, because both she and the cat had been born out of ashes, and because the man who had just walked away, the man crying alone behind the closed library door, had been too. The wall between Ellie and Beckett Moreau didn't collapse that afternoon, but it cracked, a small crack, enough to let light through. enough for both of them to know that on the other side of that wall, someone else was lonely in the same way. On her first payday, Ellie didn't buy a single thing for herself. She walked into town, stopped by Pearl's diner to pick up a sack of flour and some yeast, then turned into the little corner grocery. She bought a bundle of wildflowers, the nameless kind that grow everywhere along Montana roadsides, gathered by the shopkeeper and kept in a bucket of water, sold for the lowest price, tiny blossoms in pale purple, yellow, and white, mixed with a few sprigs of lavender that someone had planted and then forgotten at the edge of the market. She also bought 2 sets of white curtains, thin ones, the kind light can pass through while still holding back just enough to make a room feel like someone cares. All of it cost less than 1/10 of her pay, but to Ellie it was the most important investment of her life, because she wasn't buying objects. She was buying life for a house that was slowly dying. On the first Sunday, Ellie woke at 5 o'clock, before dawn, and kneaded bread dough. She worked it by hand on the wooden counter in the kitchen, steady and rhythmic, the way she'd taught herself from an old book she'd found in the orphanage library when she was 13. Back then, she hadn't had an oven to bake in, but she'd read the recipe until she knew it by heart, imagining the smell of dough turning golden in the heat, imagining that one day she'd have a kitchen of her own, and the scent of bread would be the first thing to greet the morning. 14 years later, in the kitchen of Ashford's Mafia boss, that small dream finally became real. The smell of baking bread spread through the first floor as daylight arrived, slipping down the hall, seeping through the crack beneath the library door, climbing the staircase, touching every hidden corner of the mansion that had once carried only the scent of cold wood and old whiskey. Ellie hung white curtains in the living room windows, the kitchen windows, the hallway windows. Montana morning light poured through the thin fabric and softened into something warm and gentle, light with a soul, not the sharp, merciless beam that had once cut straight through bare glass. She set the bundle of wildflowers in a glass vase she found shoved in the back of a cabinet, the price tag still on it, never used, and placed it in the center of the dining table. The little lavender stems leaned against one another, pale purple, releasing a faint fragrance into the air. And suddenly, the mansion didn't look like a beautiful coffin anymore. It looked like a home. Franklin was the first to notice. He stood in the kitchen doorway on Monday morning, took in the white curtains, the flowers on the table, breathed in the lingering scent of bread, and for the first time, the expressionless mask of his face cracked into something that came close to feeling. He went to find Beckett in the study, and Ellie heard his voice through the half-closed door, low and softer than usual. "The house looks like it did when Genevieve was alive, Mr. Moreau." A long silence followed. Ellie held her breath, fingers tightening around the broom handle, waiting for Beckett to order the flowers thrown out, the curtains taken down. The house returned to the emptiness he'd kept for 4 years as a way of mourning. But no order came, no objection, only the sound of Beckett's footsteps passing through the kitchen, pausing for a single second in front of the vase, then moving on, as if he had seen, had understood, and had chosen not to stop her. Ellie let out her breath. From that day on, she baked bread every Sunday. Every week she replaced the flowers. Every morning she drew the curtains so sunlight could spill in. And the mansion, day by day, began to breathe. Ashes, the cat with the broken leg now properly splinted, started limping around the kitchen, stretching out on the windowsill where sunlight poured through the white curtains and laid a warm stripe across the floor. It became the closest thing to life the house had besides Ellie, a small creature that had been abandoned and now slept in the sun as if it had never been hurt. Then one evening, everything changed. Ellie was carrying her plate into the kitchen to eat alone as usual, her back to the big dining table where Beckett sat, when she heard him speak. "Sit down here." Ellie turned, sure she'd misheard. Beckett sat at the head of the table, his food in front of him, his eyes fixed on the empty chair opposite. He didn't look at her when he spoke, and his voice wasn't entirely natural. It carried something stiff and awkward, as if he'd rehearsed the words in his mind for a long time before saying them, and still couldn't find a smoother way to let them out. 2 words. "Sit down here." It wasn't a boss giving an order to a servant. It was an invitation from a man who'd forgotten how to invite someone to his table, because the last person he'd invited was no longer alive. Ellie set her plate down in the empty place across from him. She sat. They ate. No one spoke. But the silence that night was different from every silence that came before. It wasn't heavy. It wasn't cold. It wasn't the silence of strangers. It was the easy silence of two people who didn't need words to understand they were together. Ashes lay under the table, its tail wrapped around the leg of Beckett's chair, and Beckett didn't nudge it away. The candle on the table burned low, because Ellie had placed candles on the dining table the week before, and Beckett hadn't told her to remove them. Just like the flowers, just like the curtains, just like the smell of bread. He hadn't told her to take away a single thing she'd brought. At the end of the meal, when Ellie stood to gather the plates, Beckett said, still staring at his water glass instead of looking at her, "You cook better than anyone I've ever hired." Ellie smiled, a small smile. A smile she didn't try to hold back because she was too startled to hide it in time. And Beckett looked at that smile. He looked longer than necessary. Longer than an employer looks at a housekeeper. Longer than a stranger looks at a stranger. Then he realized he was looking, and he turned away quickly, a little rigid, as if he'd been caught doing something he didn't allow himself to do. He stood and went upstairs, his footsteps faster than usual. Ellie remained alone by the dining table, plate in her hands, looking at the chair he'd just left, looking at the candle still burning, looking at the pale lavender flowers in the center of the table, and she knew something was changing in this house. Not only the curtains, not only the flowers, not only the smell of bread, but the man who lived inside it. Beckett Moreau was coming back to life, little by little, one meal at a time, one candle at a time. And he hadn't realized it yet, but Ellie had. That night, after the first dinner she'd ever shared at the same table with Beckett, Ellie lay in her room on the second floor of the mansion, the blanket pulled up to her chest, eyes open to the ceiling, unable to sleep. Her room was small but clean, with a twin bed, a wooden wardrobe, and a window looking out into the pine forest. And now it also had the white curtains she'd hung herself, and the wool blanket Beckett had left outside her door, without ever admitting it was his. It was the nicest room she'd ever lived in, but tonight it couldn't give her rest, because it was raining again. Montana rain on the mansion roof sounded different from rain anywhere Ellie had ever lived. Heavier, deeper, each drop striking the stone like a small hammer. And that sound, water pouring hard over a rigid surface, pulled up another sound she'd tried to bury for 18 years and had never managed to bury, the roar of water from a fire hose slamming into the roof of a burning house, the night she lost everything. She was 9. It was February. The cold was so sharp that the moisture on the window panes froze into a thin film of ice. She'd been asleep on the second floor, in a small room by the stairs, on a narrow bed her mother had built herself from pine bought secondhand at the sawmill at the end of the street. She couldn't remember who screamed first. It might have been her father. It might have been the blast from the gas stove. But what she remembered most clearly, what had sat for 18 years in the darkest corner of her mind and refused to disappear, was the smell of burning plastic, burning wood, burning hair, then the smell of burning skin, and that smell was hers. Her mother ran up the stairs, through a hallway already swallowed by flames, scooped Ellie into her arms, and rushed toward the bedroom window. Fire licked at her mother's arms, licked at Ellie's neck, licked at the left shoulder of a 9-year-old girl screaming without understanding what was happening. Her mother shoved her through the second-floor window. Ellie fell onto the grass below, pain so fierce she couldn't breathe, her neck and left shoulder searing as if someone had pressed a hot iron into her skin. She lay on the grass, staring up, and saw her mother framed in the window, flames already closing around her. Her mother didn't jump after her. Maybe she couldn't make it in time. Maybe she was too weak. Maybe she chose to push her daughter out first and there was no time left for herself. Ellie never knew the answer. She only remembered the roof collapsing, and her mother vanishing into a sea of fire. Her father was pulled out by firefighters, badly burned, and he lasted 2 days in the hospital. He held Ellie's hand in his bed, his own hand wrapped in white bandages, his eyes looking at her without truly seeing her, and he said, his voice raw and hoarse, "Baby girl, I'm sorry." Then he died. At 9 years old, Ellie lost both her mother and father within 48 hours, and the only thing she had left from that night was the burn scar stretching from just under her left ear down to her shoulder, skin puckered and discolored, ugly in a way no one could look at twice without turning away. Street Margaret's orphanage. Ellie arrived there with her neck wrapped in bandages, her eyes emptied of tears, and a small backpack holding 2 changes of clothes. On the first day, the girl in the bed beside her saw the bandages and asked, "What is that?" When the bandages came off, the child screamed and ran to the other room. From then on, Ellie became the monster. Burn face. The girl the fire licked. The children didn't sit beside her in the dining hall. No one picked her for teams. No one held her hand when they lined up to go outside. She ate alone, slept alone, cried alone, and little by little, she stopped crying, because tears need a witness to mean anything. And when no one is looking, crying feels the same as screaming into empty space. When she was 14, everything almost changed. A family came to the orphanage, a middle-aged couple, the wife with warm brown hair and a wide smile. She took Ellie's hand and walked with her in the orphanage garden, asked what she liked, what she read, what she wanted to do when she grew up. Ellie answered each question, and for the first time in 5 years, she let herself hope. For the first time, she imagined a room of her own, a family, a mother who called her by her name instead of her file number. That night, Ellie lay in bed, eyes bright, building a new life in her mind. Then she heard voices behind the director's office door, the voice of the warm, brown-haired woman who had held her hand in the garden that afternoon, whispering to her husband, and Ellie heard every word. "I don't want my children to have to look at that every day. It will scare them. That, not Scar, not girl, that." As if Ellie weren't a human being, but a broken object, something unpleasant to see. The next morning, the family didn't come back. The director looked at Ellie with pity mixed with relief, the look of someone who'd just escaped a problem, and said, "There will be another family, Eloise." But there was no other family. Never. Now, 13 years later, lying in the warmest room she'd ever had. Beneath the wool blanket the mafia boss had silently left outside her door, listening to ashes purring softly curled at the foot of the bed. Ellie stared at the small mirror on the wall across from her. In the darkness, she couldn't make out the scar clearly, only the faint outline of her own face. And she asked herself the question she had asked 1,000 times and never been able to answer. Had her mother died to save the wrong person? If her mother had known her daughter would grow up with a scar the whole world recoiled from, would be called a monster, would be rejected by every family, every employer, every man, would she still have run into the fire? Would she still have chosen to save Ellie? Or would she have turned away and let the flames take them both, so at least Ellie wouldn't have to live a life where no one wanted to look at her? Tears slid onto her pillow, soaking into the fabric, hot and salty. Ellie didn't wipe them away. She let them fall, in the dark, in the silence, in the nicest room she'd ever lived in. Still not enough to heal what had broken when she was 9. And outside the window, Montana rain kept falling, like the fire hose water that night long ago, like the sound of a 9-year-old child's tears on the grass as she watched her mother disappear into fire, like the sound of the world telling her she wasn't worth keeping. The next morning, Ellie woke with swollen eyes and a pillow still damp with tears. But she still went down to the kitchen at 6 o'clock, still made oatmeal, still brewed black coffee, still set a plate of fruit on the table in time for Beckett to come down and eat. She'd spent 27 years surviving by turning pain into repetition, and repetition doesn't need tears. Beckett ate breakfast, looked at her once, longer than usual, as if he noticed something different on her face today. But he didn't ask, and she was grateful for that. He left. Franklin followed. The mansion fell back into silence, and Ellie made a list of what she needed to buy, then drove Pearl's old car into town. Ashford in the morning was beautiful in a way that made you forget half this town ran on dirty money. Sunlight lay across the awnings of the shops. Children ran along the sidewalk. The faint scent of fresh coffee drifted from the little cafe at the end of the street. Ellie walked into the grocery, bought flour, eggs, vegetables, and as she stood choosing apples, she heard a voice behind her. "Miss Crawford?" Ellie turned and saw Neil Prescott, the restaurant owner who'd fired her on her first day in Ashford. The man who'd looked at her scar and said her appearance would affect high-end customers. The man who'd added, as she walked out the door, "Oh my God, her neck," to one of his employees. That Neil Prescott was standing in front of her now, smiling, not a strained smile, a broad, welcoming smile, the kind people reserve for honored guests. "I heard you're working for Mr. Moreau," Neil said, his voice warmer than it had been the first time, so warm Ellie almost couldn't recognize him as the same man. "If you need anything for the estate, come by my restaurant anytime. Free, completely free. Anything on the menu." Ellie looked at him. The same eyes, the same face, the same mouth that had spoken words that sent her out of his restaurant with her hand clenched so tightly around her backpack strap. Her knuckles went white, and now those eyes looked at her with respect. That face smiled at her. That mouth offered her free food. Not because she had changed. She was still Eloise Crawford, still thin, still marked by the burn scar running from her neck down to her left shoulder, still wearing a high collar even when the weather was hot. The only thing that had changed was the name behind her. Moreau. Those letters turned her from someone pushed out into someone bowed to, from a problem for customers into a valued guest offered a free meal. Ellie felt like she might vomit. Something bitter rose in her stomach. Not anger at Neil Prescott, but sadness. Sadness that the world worked this way. Sadness that her worth didn't live in who she was, but in whose shadow stood behind her. She nodded politely, said thank you in the calmest voice she could manage, and walked away. She moved quickly down Main Street, turned onto the small road leading to the parking lot, and that was when she heard it. Two men stood on the corner smoking, speaking softly enough to think no one could hear, but loudly enough that Ellie, passing less than 3 meters away, caught every word. "Moreau's keeping that Scar girl in his mansion, you know," the first one said, exhaling smoke. "Who knows what for, but look at her. Neck all burned up like that. Maybe Moreau likes something different." The second man let out a rough laugh. "Or he needs someone nobody else will take so she won't dare leave. Think about it. Where's she gonna go? Who'd hire her? Moreau gives her a room. She ought to be grateful somehow." Ellie stopped in the middle of the street, the grocery bag in her hand suddenly heavy as stone, her feet unable to move. The filthy rumor slid into her ears and immediately took root in soil that had already been torn open by 18 years of rejection. Because it made sense. It made terrifying sense. Who was she that Beckett Moreau would keep her on? What did she have? A scar people recoiled from. No degree, no family, no money, nowhere to go. He gave her work, gave her a room, gave her a warm blanket, gave her a seat at his table, and she had thought it was kindness. But what if they were right? What if she was only convenient? Someone who wouldn't dare leave. Someone Beckett kept because he knew she had no other choice. She rushed back to the mansion, set the bags on the kitchen table, went upstairs, shut her door, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she packed her backpack. She shoved clothes inside, shoved the book she was halfway through, shoved everything that belonged to her, then sat on the bed, staring at the ready bag, thinking she would leave that afternoon, that she would go say goodbye to Pearl, say thank you, and disappear before she became what that rumor had described. But she didn't go. She sat there until night fell, and then she drove to Pearl's diner. The 62-year-old woman with hands that always seemed dusted with flour watched Ellie walk in, watched the red eyes, watched the way she lowered herself into a chair, as if the whole weight of the world had settled on her shoulders. And Pearl didn't ask what happened. She set a cup of hot tea in front of Ellie and sat down across from her. Ellie told her about Neil bowing, about the talk on the corner, about how she no longer knew why she was in the mansion at all, whether it was because she needed the job, because of Beckett, because for the first time there was a place where no one stared at her scar, or because she truly had nowhere else to go, and that was the real reason, exactly as those men had said. Pearl listened to everything, didn't interrupt, then placed her hand over Ellie's, her palm warm and rough from years of kneading dough. "Listen to me," Pearl said, slow and steady. "Beckett Moreau isn't the reason you stay, and those bored men on the street aren't the reason you leave. The reason you stay has to be you, because you want to stay, because you choose to stay, not because someone keeps you, not because there's nowhere else, but because you look in the mirror and tell yourself, I deserve a place in this world, and that place is here." Ellie stared at the tea, tears dropping onto the old scratched wooden table. She didn't speak. She didn't have an answer yet. She still didn't know why she was staying, and the truth was more complicated than any simple explanation. But that night, when she returned to the mansion, she unpacked the backpack, hung her clothes back in the closet, set her book on the shelf she'd built herself from leftover wood she'd found in storage, and Ashes jumped onto the bed and curled up at her feet. She didn't have an answer, but she stayed. And sometimes, staying is already an answer big enough. 3 nights after the day Ellie almost left, she woke up close to 1 o'clock in the morning because Ashes was scratching at her bedroom door, begging to be let out. She opened it, and the cat, still limping, darted down the stairs. Ellie was about to return to bed when she saw a thin streak of yellow light spilling from the library at the end of the first-floor hallway, a desk lamp. At 1 in the morning, She'd lived in this mansion long enough to know Beckett often stayed up late in his office, but the office was in the basement, the one place she wasn't allowed to go near. The library was different. The library was the room with the photograph of the black-haired woman, the room with dust-coated shelves, the room Ellie'd come to understand over weeks was where Beckett went when he didn't want to be a boss anymore, when he only wanted to be an ordinary man sitting in the room where his wife had once read books. Ellie hesitated. She stood at the top of the stairs in the dark, one hand on the railing, and thought she should go back to her room, that Franklin had made the rules clear, that she shouldn't involve herself in anything beyond cooking and cleaning. But instead she went into the kitchen, boiled water, brewed a cup of tea, and carried it to the library door. She knocked softly twice. There was no answer. But the door wasn't locked, and Ellie pushed it just enough to see inside. Beckett sat in an old leather armchair facing a fireplace that wasn't lit, Genevieve's photograph on the mantel in his direct line of sight. The whiskey bottle on the small table beside the chair was more than half gone, and the glass in his hand was nearly empty. He wasn't drunk. Ellie knew that immediately, because his eyes were still bright, still sharp, still the steel-gray eyes she'd grown used to seeing every morning at breakfast. He wasn't drinking to forget. He was drinking to feel, because maybe, at some point over the last 4 years, Beckett Moreau had gone so numb he needed whiskey just to remember he could still hurt. "I brought you tea," Ellie said gently from the doorway, not stepping inside, giving him the right to refuse. Beckett looked at her, looked at the tea. Then he tilted his head the smallest amount, but enough for Ellie to understand she was allowed. She walked in, set the cup beside the whiskey bottle, and turned as if to leave. But Beckett said, "Sit down," not in the voice of an order, not in the polite invitation he'd used at dinner the other night. In the voice of someone drowning who had just seen a person on the shore. Ellie sat in the small chair across from him, silent, waiting, not asking, not pushing. She'd learned from the stray cat in the garden that wounded things need time, not questions. Beckett stared at Genevieve's photograph, and he began to speak, not because Ellie had asked, but because tonight, after 4 years of silence, the wall inside him had cracked wide enough for words to slip out. "Her name was Genevieve," he said, his voice low and slow, as if each word had to be lifted from a very deep place. "The daughter of an English teacher at Ashford High. Her father hated me. He knew who I was, knew what the Moreau family did, and he told Genevieve that if she married me, he'd never look at her again." He paused, took a drink of whiskey, then continued. "She married me anyway, and her father kept his word. He didn't speak to his daughter again until the day she died. Not once. Silence. Ellie didn't say anything. She just sat there, hands folded together on her lap, listening. "Genevieve loved me when I was nobody," Beckett said, still staring at the photograph. "When I was just a kid running errands for my uncle. When I didn't have a dollar to my name. When this whole town looked at me with contempt. Not fear like they do now. She saw me before I became Mr. Moreau. And when I became Mr. Moreau, she was the only one who dared look me in the eye and tell me I was wrong." He set the whiskey glass down, and Ellie noticed his hand tremble, just slightly. The kind of tremor you'd miss if you weren't watching closely. "She got sick," he said, his voice rougher, lower, as if something were tightening around his throat from the inside. "Cancer. The doctors said 6 months. She lasted 8. 8 months in bed, weaker every day, smiling less every day. And I sat there beside her, every day, and I couldn't do anything." He lifted his gaze to the ceiling, and Ellie saw his eyes were red, not from whiskey, but from something deeper, older, the kind of pain that had lived there for 4 years and never softened. "I could buy this whole town," he said, his voice trembling faintly. "I can make anyone kneel. I can break anyone who stands in my way. But I couldn't buy my wife one more day, just one." And she lay there, so thin I could count every rib through her skin, and she still smiled at me. She still held my hand, and she said, "Beckett, I'm not afraid to die. I'm only afraid you'll forget how to live when I'm not here." He stopped, drew in one long, slow breath, the kind of breath a person takes when they're trying not to shatter. "She was right," he said, almost a whisper. "I forgot." Silence filled the room, heavy and deep, but not suffocating. Ellie sat in the small chair, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, but she didn't let them fall, because tonight wasn't her night. Tonight belonged to him. "She was the only one who called me by my real name," Beckett said, looking back at the photograph. To everyone else in this world, I'm Mr. Moreau, the boss, the man they fear, the man they bow to on the street and curse under their breath afterward. But to Genevieve, I was just Beckett. Just Beckett. And when she died, that name died too. No one in this world calls me that anymore. Ellie stayed silent for a long time after he finished, because she knew he didn't need comfort, didn't need someone to say, I understand or everything will be okay, because those words would be lies, and Beckett Moreau had lived among enough lies to recognize one more. She only said, gently, simply, the only truth she had to offer in that moment. She was lucky to be loved by you like that. Beckett looked at her. Not a passing glance, not the look of an employer at a housekeeper. The look of someone who had just spoken the heaviest thing in his chest and received an answer that wasn't pity, wasn't a cliché, but the truth. In those steel gray eyes, for the first time, Ellie saw something warm, small, fragile, like a candle just catching in a room that had been dark for 4 years. And in that moment, Ellie understood something she'd sensed for a long time but had never dared to say out loud. Beneath the ice, beneath the expensive suit, beneath the voice cold as steel and the hands that had given brutal orders, Beckett Moreau was drowning. Drowning in a loneliness no one saw because they were too busy being afraid of him. Just like her. Exactly like her. 2 lonely people in a library at nearly 2 in the morning, one carrying a scar on her skin, one carrying a scar inside his chest, and both of them used to no one bothering to look past the surface. Ellie stood, quietly, picked up the tea that had gone cold, and stepped to the door. Before she closed it, she turned her head and looked at him one last time. Beckett was still sitting there, but the whiskey wasn't being poured again, and his hand was resting on the teacup she had left behind. A week after that night in the library, things between Ellie and Beckett didn't change in any obvious way, and yet they didn't feel the same either. He was still quiet, still ate breakfast and left, still didn't explain where he went or what he did, but sometimes, when Ellie set a cup of tea outside the library door on nights when the light was still on, the next morning the cup was empty. He didn't say thank you. She didn't need him to. Some things are bigger than words. And both of them, in their own ways, had lived in silence long enough to understand that. On Saturday morning, Ellie drove into town to buy groceries for the new week. The Ashford sky was crystal clear. Warm, golden autumn sunlight spread across the shop awnings. That gentle Montana light that comes right before winter crashes in and turns everything white. She parked in front of the grocery, stepped out with her cloth bag, and walked along the main street. She was almost used to Ashford now, used to the bakery on the corner, used to the old man selling flowers by the post office, used even to the way people looked at her these days, not with disgust anymore, but with curiosity mixed with caution, because the name Moreau sat on her back like armor she'd never asked for. She passed the old laundromat at the end of the street, and that was when she saw the child. A little girl sat on the concrete step in front of the shop, knees pulled tight to her chest, face buried in folded arms. Small, thin, around 8 years old, maybe 9, hard to tell because she was too small for her age. The smallness of a child who hasn't been fed enough. Tangled brown hair, a white t-shirt torn at the shoulder, dirty. And when the girl lifted her head at the sound of Ellie's footsteps, Ellie saw it. Her left eye was swollen and bruised, dark purple, the kind of bruise that doesn't come from a fall but from a hit. Because Ellie knew the difference. She'd seen enough bruises in the orphanage to tell an accident from a fist. The child looked at Ellie with eyes Ellie recognized immediately. The eyes of a creature that has been hit so many times it no longer cries from pain, only from exhaustion, from not knowing what to do next. Ellie stopped. She didn't shout. She didn't panic. She didn't rush in and wrap the child in a hug the way a good adult in a movie would. She knew children who'd been hit fear suddenness more than they fear pain, because every unexpected movement might be the next slap. Instead, Ellie sat down, right there on the step, beside the child, level with her eyes. Not too close, far enough that the girl didn't feel cornered, but close enough that she knew Ellie was there. "Do you want a pastry?" Ellie asked, her voice ordinary and gentle, as if she were asking what the weather was like. The girl looked at her, wary, frightened, but also hungry, and hunger finally won. She nodded, so slight it was almost invisible. Nope, stood, walked the 10 steps to the bakery, bought 2 apple-filled waffles, then came back and sat in the exact same place. She handed one to the child, kept one for herself, and they ate in silence. The girl ate fast, the way people eat when they don't know if there will be another meal, swallowing too quickly, crumbs falling onto her shirt without bothering to brush them away. When she finished, Ellie asked, still in that same soft voice, "What's your name?" "Molly." "Molly, who hit you?" The child was silent for a long time, tiny fingers tearing the pastry paper into scraps. Then she said, so quietly the autumn breeze almost carried it away, "My stepfather." Ellie didn't change her expression. She didn't look shocked or angry, because she knew a strong reaction would make the girl close up instantly, make her think she'd said something wrong, make her afraid she'd caused trouble. She only nodded, slowly, then said, "Do you want to come with me to a place with a very kind woman? She makes the best baked goods, and she'll help you." Molly looked at her, hesitated, then nodded. Ellie stood and offered her hand, and the girl took it. A tiny hand, cold, bony, gripping Ellie's fingers like a lifeline. They walked down the street slowly. Ellie didn't tug or hurry her, letting the child match her own pace. And when they passed a sunlit shop window that caught their reflections, Molly glanced over and saw it, the scar. Ellie's collar had shifted slightly when she bent to take the girl's hand, and the burn scar showed, puckered and discolored, stretching from under her ear down to her shoulder. Ellie felt the child staring, and she braced for the reaction she'd seen 100 times. Fear, disgust, eyes turning away. But Molly didn't turn away. The girl stopped, lifted her free hand, and touched the scar on Ellie's neck, lightly, like touching a butterfly wing. "Does it hurt you too?" Molly asked, a whisper. And in that question there was no disgust, no sick curiosity, only the purest compassion of an 8-year-old who knows what pain is. Ellie felt something hot rise behind her eyes, but she didn't cry. She smiled, a small smile, a real one, and said, "Yes, it hurt me too, but I healed. You will too." She brought Molly to Pearl's diner. The 62-year-old woman took one look at the bruised face as the child walked in, asked no questions, simply brought an extra pastry and a glass of warm milk, then went into the back to call the sheriff. Ellie sat beside Molly at the table by the window, stroking the child's head while she drank the milk, her hand smoothing the tangled hair, the same hand Neil Prescott hadn't wanted customers to see in his restaurant, the same hand Warren Holt had laid money on a table to avoid touching, the same hand Douglas Pratt had mocked as burned meat, and now that hand was comforting a battered child, and the child didn't flinch or recoil. She leaned into Ellie's shoulder and closed her eyes. Outside Pearl's, across the street, a black car sat quietly under a maple tree. Beckett Moreau was in the back seat, the window lowered halfway, and he had seen everything, from the moment Ellie sat down on the step beside the child, to the moment she bought the pastries, to the moment she held Molly's hand and walked her down the street, to the moment the child touched the scar on Ellie's neck, and Ellie smiled instead of crying. He had seen the hand the world recoiled from stroking the head of a beaten child, and that child didn't shrink away but leaned into her as if she were the safest place on earth. Franklin sat in the driver's seat, watched Beckett's face in the rearview mirror, and stayed silent, because on that face there was something Franklin Doyle, who had followed Beckett Moreau for 20 years, had never seen. Not anger, not coldness, not emptiness, but respect. The slow, certain realization that the woman in that small diner, the woman Ashford had once turned its back on, wasn't the one who needed saving. She was the one who went to save other people. And Beckett Moreau, the mafia boss sitting in a sleek black car, for the first time in 4 years, felt small in the presence of a woman. That evening, after the meal, Beckett didn't go into the library the way he usually did. He went out to the front porch, sat on a wooden chair Ellie had never once seen him use, and looked out at the pine forest shifting color under the autumn Montana sunset. Yellow leaves drifted slowly from the maples along the driveway, turning in the air before settling onto the stone steps, and the air was cold enough to turn breath into a thin mist, but not yet cold enough to force you back inside. Ellie finished washing the dishes, dried her hands on a towel, and stepped onto the porch to ask if he wanted more coffee. But when she opened the door, Beckett turned to look at her, and something in those gray eyes stopped her mid-step. Not the familiar coldness, not the emptiness she'd seen through the first weeks. It was a tension, deep and steady, the look of someone who has been thinking for a long time about what he's about to say, and still isn't sure whether he should say it at all. "Sit down here," he said softly, and Ellie sat in the chair beside him, the two of them facing the same stretch of sky, turning from orange to deep violet above the pines. Silence stretched out. 1 minute, 2. Leaves kept falling. Ashes lay curled beneath Ellie's chair, tail wrapped around her ankle, and the autumn air cooled against her skin. Ellie didn't ask. She didn't push. She'd learned that Beckett Moreau needed time before he spoke. And every time he said something that truly mattered, there was always a silence, so long another person might think he'd forgotten. But he hadn't forgotten. He was finding a way to set each brick into a sentence. Then he said, his voice low and slow, his eyes still on the trees, "The people who turned you away." Ellie went still. She hadn't expected him to bring that up. The thing she'd said on the first day when she pulled her collar down and told him plainly that 3 places had fired her because of the scar. She'd assumed he'd forgotten, or didn't care, because Beckett Moreau had 1,000 things more important to think about than the past of his housekeeper. But he remembered. "Did any of them," Beckett went on, each word measured and clear as if he were weighing it on his tongue, "ever ask who you are?" Ellie looked at him, confused. Beckett turned, gray eyes fixed on hers, and he continued, "Did anyone ask what you dream about? What you're afraid of? What makes you laugh? What hurts you? Or did they all just look at the scar and decide who you were?" The question hung in the cold autumn air like something with weight, heavy and unmistakable, impossible to ignore. Ellie opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She swallowed, feeling her throat tighten, and she thought of Neil Prescott, who saw the scar and spoke about the restaurant's image, of Warren Holt, who put money on the table because he didn't dare hand it to her, of Douglas Pratt, drunk and grabbing at her blouse and laughing, of the family that came to the orphanage and walked away because they didn't want their children to see that every day, of the director who told her she should get used to no one wanting to keep her. No. Never. Not once, in 27 years, had anyone asked her who she was. They all looked at the scar, and the scar answered for her before she ever had the chance to speak. She shook her head slowly, her eyes beginning to burn. "No," she said, barely above a whisper. "No one ever asked." Beckett didn't nod. He didn't look surprised. It was as if he'd known the answer before he asked, and the question was only so she could hear herself say the truth out loud. Then he looked at her, straight on, deep, with the eyes Ellie had once believed no longer had the ability to see anyone but Genevieve's photograph in the library, and he said, "Then tell me, who is Eloise Crawford, really?" 27 years. Ellie had been alive for 27 years, and not once, not from a single person, had she been asked that. People asked where the scar came from. People asked if it hurt. People asked what she could do, what she could endure, whether she could hide it. But no one asked who she was. No one asked what she dreamed when she closed her eyes, what she feared when she opened them, what she liked, what she hated, what she loved, what she cried for, what she smiled for. No one looked past the scar to find the human being beneath it. Until tonight. On the porch of the mansion, under the Montana autumn sky, the mafia boss, the whole town feared, had asked the orphan girl with the burn scar the question the world had forgotten to ask. Ellie cried. She couldn't stop it. She didn't want to stop it. Tears surged up, hot and salty, sliding down her cheeks, dropping onto her hands clenched tight on her lap. And she cried not from pain, not from sadness, but because for the first time in her life, someone wanted to see her. She told him. Her voice shook, broke. But she told him, because he asked, and because she'd waited 27 years for someone to ask. "I'm the girl who taught herself to read in the orphanage when no one bothered to teach me, because the orphanage library had books, and books never stared at my scar. I'm the girl who stayed up until 3 in the morning sewing clothes for the little ones from scraps I begged from the tailor shop at the end of the street, because those kids didn't have anyone to buy them new things either, and I took nothing, not a single cent, because seeing them wear something that fit and smile was enough. I dream of a house with flowers on the porch, and the smell of bread baking every morning, where when I open the door, someone smiles at me. I laugh when I watch rain fall on a lake, because rain on a lake looks like someone is dancing, and it's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen that didn't cost me a cent. And my heart breaks," she stopped, swallowing tears, "every time someone looks at me and only sees the scar. Every time. For 27 years. Every time. Silence. Leaves falling. Ashes purring softly under the chair. And Beckett Moreau sat there. Didn't interrupt. Didn't look away. Didn't offer pity. didn't show discomfort, only sat and listened to every word with the kind of complete attention Ellie had never received from anyone. When she finished, when the last broken sob quieted, and only the heavy breathing of someone who has finally set down the heaviest thing she's been carrying remained, Beckett said, his voice low, gentle, certain, "That's who you are, and that's the woman I want to know." Then he lifted his hand, slowly, as if asking permission with the pace of the movement instead of with words. His fingertips touched the scar on her neck, gentle, tracing the edge of puckered, discolored skin from beneath her ear down to her collarbone, and Ellie held her breath. Not from fear, not from pain, but because in 27 years, every hand that had touched that scar had carried disgust, morbid curiosity, or roughness. Douglas Pratt's hand yanking at her collar, children's hands pointing in the orphanage, the hand of the woman who almost adopted her pulling back when she saw it. But this hand, the rough hand of Ashford's mafia boss, moved over her scar with reverence, as if it wasn't something ugly, as if it were a map of the road she'd survived, and he was reading it with his fingertips. Ellie closed her eyes, tears sliding over his fingers, and she knew in that moment, on a cold porch with yellow leaves falling, and a warm hand on a scar that had always been cold, that she had begun to love Beckett Moreau. Not because he was powerful, not because he gave her a place to stay, but because he was the first, and the only, one to ask who she was, and then stay long enough to hear the answer. The next morning, Ellie woke with swollen eyes, but a heart lighter than any morning in 27 years, as if last night she'd finally set down a suitcase she'd been carrying since she was 9, without realizing how heavy it was until her fingers let go. She went down to the kitchen at 6 o'clock, made oatmeal, brewed coffee, set a plate of fruit on the table, and waited. Beckett came down the stairs at 7, as he did every day, but everything else was wrong. He didn't look at her, not the kind of not looking from the first weeks when he simply didn't care, but the deliberate kind, the way someone avoids your eyes because he's afraid that if he looks, he'll have to face something he isn't ready for. He sat down, ate fast, almost swallowing, didn't say the oatmeal's good today or anything at all, set his fork down, stood, and walked straight out the door with his back to her from start to finish. The door shut. The engine turned over. Gravel crunched under the tires, then went quiet. Ellie stood in the kitchen with the dish towel in her hands, staring at the empty chair Beckett had just left. And she felt something familiar and cold crawl up into her chest. She'd been wrong. She'd cried in front of him, told him everything, let him touch her scar, let him see the real person beneath all the armor she'd built for 27 years, and now he was retreating, like everyone else. Only this time it hurt more, because this time she'd let herself hope. The second day was the same. Beckett ate breakfast in a cold silence, not looking, not speaking, leaving immediately. At dinner he didn't come to the table. Franklin carried a plate upstairs. Ellie cooked, cleaned, did laundry, and every time she passed the library, she looked at the closed door and wondered if he was sitting inside regretting he'd asked that question, regretting he'd touched her scar, regretting he'd let a soft moment exist between the boss and the housekeeper. She began thinking about the backpack, that backpack again. It sat on top of the wardrobe, neatly folded, waiting, always waiting, because Ellie had never truly believed she was allowed to stay anywhere long enough to put it away for good. On the afternoon of the third day, Ellie was wiping down the kitchen table when she heard Beckett's car return far earlier than usual, at least 4 hours early. She heard the front door open, heavy footsteps in the hall, and then those footsteps stopped at the kitchen doorway. She turned and saw Beckett standing there, arms wrapped around something wooden, large and heavy, his body angled so he could squeeze it through the frame. A bookshelf. Oak. Handmade, she knew at once, because the joints weren't perfectly even, because one corner still felt slightly rough, because there was a spot that had been planed too deep and then smoothed back down with sandpaper. Beckett set the shelf on the kitchen table, right in front of Ellie, didn't look at her, didn't say a word, then turned and walked away. His steps were fast and stiff, the steps of someone who has just done something that confuses him and wants to get out of the room as quickly as possible. Ellie stared at the bookshelf. She lifted her hand and ran her fingers over the wood, feeling the grain under her fingertips, the uneven sanding, and she understood. He didn't regret it. He wasn't pulling away. He just didn't know how to move forward after last night. Beckett Moreau, the man who gave orders to an entire town without a second thought, had spent 2 days avoiding her not because he wanted to forget, but because he didn't know what to do with what he was feeling. And instead of speaking, he built her a bookshelf. With his hands. For her. Because she'd said she loved books, and he'd listened. From that afternoon on, everything changed. Not in a rush, not with drama, but slowly, gently, the way Montana autumn turns into winter, a little colder each day, until no one can point to the exact moment the season changed. Beckett started coming home early, sitting on the tall kitchen stool while Ellie cooked, asking what she was reading, then falling quiet as he listened to her talk about the book, in a voice so excited she couldn't control it. Ellie began brewing 2 cups of tea each night instead of 1, setting one outside the library door, and in the morning both cups were empty. Ashes climbed into Beckett's lap for the first time, and he didn't push the cat away, only stared down with the puzzled look of someone who isn't used to being loved without a reason. Then one afternoon, Ellie went into town and came back with her hair cut to her shoulders. She'd had it trimmed at the little barber shop at the end of the street, and when she looked in the mirror there, she saw the burn scar completely exposed. From under her ear down to her left shoulder, nothing covering it. No hair, no high collar, nothing at all. For the first time in her life, she let the world see it without hiding. When she stepped into the kitchen that evening, Beckett was sitting on the tall stool, a cup of tea in his hand, and he looked up. He saw the short hair. He saw the scar no longer covered. He saw her, all of her, no pieces missing, nothing hidden, and he said, in a voice Ellie had never heard him use, soft and low, almost tender, "You're beautiful." 2 words. Like the oatmeal's good today from the first weeks, but completely different, because these 2 words weren't about oatmeal, weren't about food or anything else. They were about her, and Beckett said them while looking straight at the scar she'd hidden for 18 years. Ellie didn't answer. She only felt her eyes burn, and she turned away, pretending to be busy with the soup pot on the stove, but the smile on her mouth wouldn't stay hidden. Then the rainy night came. A hard rain, the kind of Montana rain so violent it knocked the power out across the area, the mansion sinking into darkness, and Ellie lit candles in the library because it was the only place with enough stored away. Beckett walked in and sat in his familiar armchair, candlelight flickering over his face, softening sharp lines, turning his eyes from steel gray into a warmer gray. They sat by candlelight, listening to the rain, and Beckett said, his voice so low it almost blended into the storm, "I'm afraid I'm too broken to love anyone again. My hands have done things you wouldn't want to know. And my head, the head that gave orders any normal person would be sickened by. I'm not a good man, Ellie. I never have been." Ellie looked at him in the candlelight, looked at eyes afraid of something she was sure he rarely feared, afraid of being truly seen, and then left. She reached out and took his hand, her smaller hand inside his large, rough one, and she said, "I thought I was too broken too. For 27 years, I believed no one would want to keep something that had been burned. But maybe," she squeezed his hand gently, "maybe 2 broken things can fit together." Beckett looked at her hand in his, then up into her eyes, and in the trembling candlelight, he leaned in, slowly, very slowly, giving her all the time in the world to pull away if she wanted, because he was used to people pulling away from him, only for different reasons. But Ellie didn't pull away. She closed her eyes, and the first kiss touched her lips, light and hesitant and trembling, the kiss of 2 people so used to rejection that even when they are being loved, they still fear that at any moment the other person will open their eyes and say, "I was wrong." But no one said it. No one opened their eyes. No one pulled away. There was only rain on the roof, candlelight dancing on the walls, and 2 hands gripping each other as if both of them were afraid that if they let go, this moment would vanish and never come back. A week after the candlelit kiss, on Saturday morning, Beckett came down to the kitchen earlier than usual, while Ellie was kneading bread dough for Sunday, her hands dusted white with flour all the way to her elbows. He paused in the doorway, hands in his pockets, and spoke in the voice Ellie had begun to recognize as the one he used when he was about to say something important, but didn't want it to sound important. "I need to pick up produce from my mother's farm. You're coming with me." Not a question, but not an order either. It lived somewhere in between, that gray space where Beckett Moreau spent most of his time when he talked to Ellie, the place between a boss giving commands and a man trying to invite someone without knowing how. Ellie looked at him, looked down at the flour on her hands, then nodded. 30 minutes later, she sat in the passenger seat of Beckett's black car, The first time since arriving in Ashford that she'd been inside it, instead of watching it sit outside the gate like a silent symbol of power. Beckett drove. Franklin didn't come, and that told Ellie more than any words could, because Beckett Moreau didn't go anywhere without Franklin unless he was going somewhere he felt safe enough not to need protection, and the only place like that was his mother's house. They drove through town and out toward the outskirts, turned onto a dirt road winding around the base of a hill, where a white wooden fence ran along open fields and cows grazed in the autumn sun. The Moreau farm appeared after the final curve, a one-story wooden house nestled between vegetable beds and a flower garden, modest and warm, the complete opposite of the gray stone mansion in the pine woods. There were small floral curtains in the windows, flower pots on the porch, a wooden swing hanging under the awning, and everything about it said this was the home of someone who knew how to love, not the home of someone who knew how to rule. The door opened before Beckett even had the chance to knock. A 70-year-old woman stood in the doorway, petite, silver hair pinned in a low bun, warm brown eyes, a face lined with wrinkles, but each line looked as if it had been made by smiling instead of sorrow. June Moreau looked at her son, then looked at Ellie, and something crossed her face that Ellie couldn't read right away because it was too layered. Joy and surprise and emotion and understanding all at once, as if she'd been waiting for this moment for a long time but never dared believe it would come. "My son," she said, looking at Beckett. Then she looked at Ellie, stepped forward, and hugged her. Not a polite handshake, not a social nod, an embrace, tight and warm, the kind a grandmother gives a granddaughter returning from far away, the kind of hug Ellie hadn't received from anyone since her mother died in that fire 18 years ago. Ellie went rigid in her arms because she didn't know what to do. Her body didn't remember how to respond to being held, but then she caught the scent of butter and lavender in the woman's hair. Her shoulders loosened, and she let herself be hugged, eyes closing, breathing in slowly, thinking that a mother's embrace must smell the same everywhere. Beckett stood behind them in silence, watching his mother hold Ellie, his own face softening in a way only his mother could soften the face of a mafia boss. June led Ellie out to the back garden, where tomato plants hung heavy with red fruit and green beans climbed up wooden trellises. She handed Ellie a basket, and the two of them picked vegetables together. June's hands quick, Ellie's slower because she wasn't used to it. But June didn't rush her, only pointed out what was ripe and what wasn't, and between the rows, she began to talk. "He used to laugh so much when he was little, you know?" June said, eyes going distant as her hands kept harvesting tomatoes. "Loud, often, running all over this farm, hugging the cows, climbing trees, falling and crying for 3 seconds and then laughing again. He was the happiest child I ever saw." She paused, set a tomato into the basket, then spoke more softly. "Then he grew up. Then he went into that world. Then Genevieve came. And Genevieve was the only light that still kept him on the human side. When Genevieve died, that smile died with her. 4 years, honey. 4 years he hasn't smiled. 4 years he hasn't brought anyone here." She turned to Ellie, set another tomato down, and took Ellie's hands in hers. Her hands were small and warm and rough with garden soil, and she held Ellie's hands steadily, looking straight into her eyes. "This morning he called me," June said. "He told me, 'Mom, I'm bringing someone over.' 4 years, honey. 4 years he hasn't said those words." Ellie's eyes stung, but she blinked fast and kept the tears back. Not out of shame, but because she wanted to hear everything this woman was going to say. June squeezed her hands more gently, her voice lowering, tender but firm. "Listen to me. You're not a replacement for Genevieve. Genevieve is Genevieve. You are you, and that's what's beautiful. I don't need you to be like my former daughter-in-law. I need you to be yourself, because you, as you, are the reason my son called his mother for the first time in 4 years and said he was bringing someone home. Genevieve would want my son to be happy, and if you're the one bringing him that happiness, then Genevieve would love you for it." Ellie couldn't hold the tears anymore. She cried quietly among the vegetable rows, her hands still in June's, and June didn't say anything else, only pulled her into her arms again and let her cry into her shoulder, amid the smell of ripe tomatoes and damp soil and lavender. And Ellie thought this was what orphans never know they're missing until they're finally given it, the arms of a mother telling you that you deserve to be here. That afternoon, they drove back to the mansion in silence, the car packed with produce and a jar of strawberry jam June pressed into Ellie's hands at goodbye. That night, after dinner, Ellie passed the library on her way upstairs and stopped because the door was slightly open. Inside, Beckett stood in front of the fireplace, where Genevieve's photograph had stood for 4 years. He held the frame in his hands, stared at the smile of the black-haired woman, stared a long time, deeply, as if he were saying goodbye without needing words. Then he bent and kissed the glass, slow and gentle, lips touching the frozen smile, and Ellie saw his shoulders shake, just once, and then he straightened. He opened the drawer of the small table by the fireplace, placed the photograph inside, gentle and careful, like placing a baby into a cradle, then closed the drawer, not throwing it away, not forgetting, putting it away, because that memory deserved to be kept in the safest place, instead of hanging on the wall, reminding him every day of what he'd lost. He was ready to move forward. Beckett turned and saw Ellie in the doorway. She didn't pretend she hadn't seen. He didn't pretend he hadn't cried. They looked at each other across the quiet library, where the mantel now held only a rectangular patch, slightly lighter than the surrounding wood, the imprint of the photograph that had stood there for 4 years. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to, because the way Beckett looked at Ellie in that moment said everything. He didn't choose her because she was like Genevieve. He chose her because she was Ellie, the orphan girl with the burn scar, the woman who planted flowers in a cold mansion, who picked up a stray cat in the rain, who cried on the porch when she was asked who she was. He chose her because she was herself. And that, just as June had said in the garden that afternoon, was what was beautiful. 3 days after the trip to June's farm, Ellie woke early as she always did, went down to the kitchen, brewed coffee, and looked out the window toward the driveway as daylight first came in. She almost dropped the coffee pot. In front of the iron gate, right in the middle of the stone path, there was a bouquet. Or rather, there was what used to be a bouquet. The stems were burned black, the stalks bent and snapped, the petals turned to ash but still held their shape, as if someone had carefully set them on fire and then placed them here to deliver a message without writing a single word. The burned bouquet lay on the gray stone, and Ellie stared at it through the kitchen window, and the first thing she thought of wasn't fear but smell. The smell of burning flowers, burning plastic, burning wood, the smell of the night she was 9, and she had to grip the edge of the sink to stay upright because her knees suddenly went weak. Franklin was the next one to see it. He stepped outside, picked up the charred bouquet, turned it over in his hands, his face unreadable, but his jaw tightening until the tendons stood out, then carried it inside and set it on Beckett's desk without a word. When Beckett came down at 7, he saw the burned flowers, and Ellie, watching from the kitchen doorway, saw his expression change. Not fear. Beckett Moreau didn't fear. It was anger, the cold kind, the kind that doesn't shout or smash things, the kind of anger so quiet it thickens the air in a room. He looked at Franklin. Franklin said 2 words. Sutter. Just that. Just a name, and Ellie saw Beckett's gray eyes go dark. Dark in a way she had never seen. Darker than the night he threatened someone on the phone. Darker than when he spoke about Genevieve's death. Dark in a way that told her immediately that Raymond Sutter, whoever he was, had touched something no one was allowed to touch. Ellie didn't ask who Sutter was. She didn't need to. She'd lived in Ashford long enough to hear the whispered fragments, to know Beckett wasn't the only boss, to know there were territories, borders, quiet wars the ordinary people never saw, but that always lived just under the town's calm surface. And the burned bouquet wasn't a threat meant for Beckett. The burned bouquet was a message that Sutter knew about her, knew she was here, knew she mattered, and knew she was the place where Beckett Moreau, for the first time in 4 years, could be hurt. Over the next week, everything shifted. Ellie went into town for groceries as usual, but this time she noticed a black pickup parked at the end of the street when she walked into the store, still parked there when she came out, and when she drove home it followed her for half the distance before turning off down another road. She didn't panic, because panic is a luxury she'd stopped buying a long time ago, but her hands tightened on the wheel, and in the rearview mirror she watched the black truck grow smaller and disappear, and she knew the darkness of Beckett's world had brushed the edge of her life. That night, Ellie told Beckett about the truck. She told him calmly, as if she were describing the weather, because she didn't want him to see she was afraid. But Beckett wasn't calm. He pushed back from the table, stood, paced the kitchen, fists clenching and releasing, jaw locked, and Ellie watched the mafia boss Ashford feared come back through the softer Beckett she'd grown used to in recent weeks. "You have to leave," he said, his voice hard, final. "Go to my mother's farm. Stay there until I handle it." Ellie looked at him. She saw the fire in his gray eyes, the tight fist, the man trying to shove her away to protect her. And it felt too much like every other shove she'd lived through, every other time someone decided she didn't belong. This time the reason wasn't disgust but fear, but the result was the same. She was being sent away again, told to go again, removed again. "No," Ellie said, and she surprised herself with how steady her voice sounded. Beckett stared at her, brows drawn tight, not used to being refused, and especially not by a thin young woman with a burn scar standing in his kitchen. "Ellie, you don't understand." "I understand," she said, cutting him off. The first time she had ever cut off Beckett Moreau, and she saw him flinch at it. "I understand someone dangerous wants to hurt you through me. I understand you're trying to protect me. But listen to me." She stepped closer, looking up because he was nearly a head taller, and her eyes locked onto his, steady, unshaken. "My whole life, people have pushed me away. The orphanage pushed me out when I was old enough. A family came to adopt me, and then walked away because they didn't want to look at my scar. Neil Prescott pushed me out of his restaurant. Warren Holt pushed me out of his hotel. Douglas Pratt pushed me into the street at midnight. Everyone, for 27 years, has pushed me away. You will not be the next one." She said the last words in a voice she didn't know she had. Not loud, not screaming, but so certain it stopped Beckett cold. He looked at her. He looked at her brown eyes burning with something fierce, at the scar fully visible on her neck, now that her short hair no longer covered it, at her small hand clenched at her side, and he saw what she didn't realize she was showing him, a kind of strength that didn't belong to bosses or warriors, but to a woman who had been pushed away her entire life and had finally decided, for the first time, to stand still. He understood. If he pushed her away now, even to protect her, he would destroy the very thing he was trying to protect. Because Ellie wasn't staying because she had nowhere else to go. She was staying because she chose to stay. And if he took that choice from her, he would be no different from the people who had taken it before him. Beckett didn't speak. He nodded, heavy and slow, then turned, grabbed his phone, called Franklin, and what followed moved fast and quiet the way Beckett Moreau's world always moved. The security cameras were doubled. 2 men Ellie had never seen before appeared and parked at the gate, taking turns on watch. Franklin received new orders. He was not to leave Ellie when she went into town, always within sight, always. Ellie could feel that darkness closing around her. Not inside the mansion. The mansion still had flowers and white curtains, and the smell of bread and ashes sleeping on the windowsill. But outside those 4 walls, Beckett's world was creeping into her life, silent and certain, the way Montana winter creeps over the ground and turns everything white without asking anyone's permission. But Ellie didn't run. She cooked, hung curtains, picked flowers, stroked ashes, and every night she sat on the porch beside Beckett and watched the pine forest shift from gold to bare. She had decided to stay. And staying beside Beckett Moreau meant accepting all of it. Not only the candlelit kiss and the oak bookshelf, but also the burned bouquet at the gate and the black truck trailing her down the street. The call came at 4 o'clock in the morning. Ellie was asleep, ashes curled at the foot of the bed, and the ring of Beckett's phone carried down the second-floor hallway, loud enough to drag her out of a dream. She heard Beckett's door open, fast footsteps on the wood floor, his voice on the phone, low and sharp, the words too muffled for her to catch, and then the knock at her door. She opened it. Beckett stood there in sleep clothes, hair mussed, but his eyes were fully awake, fully cold, and she knew something terrible had happened before he even spoke. "Pearls," he said, 2 words, but the way he said them, the way he looked at her, the way his jaw locked as if he were forcing something back down in his chest, made the floor tilt under her feet. She didn't ask anything else. She grabbed her coat, ran down the stairs, and Beckett drove her into town through the dark before dawn. Franklin in the front seat, silent, one hand tucked inside his suit jacket where Ellie knew he kept something she didn't want to think about. They arrived, and Ellie saw Pearl's diner before the car even fully stopped. The glass door had been shattered, shards scattered across the sidewalk, glittering under the one streetlight still burning at the end of the block. Inside, tables and chairs had been overturned, toppled, piled like kindling. The interior wall had been spray-painted with red, crude, and jagged, obscene words Ellie could read from the car, and her stomach turned, not from the meaning, but from the pure hatred running through every stroke of paint. The register had been smashed, the drawer yanked open, and no money was taken. Because this wasn't robbery. This was a message, and a message doesn't need cash. It only needs fear. Ellie threw the car door open and ran before Beckett could say anything. She ran through the broken glass, her shoes crunching on shards, and she found Pearl. Pearl was sitting on the floor in the middle of the wreckage, back against the kitchen counter, her left hand wrapped in white cloth torn from a dish towel she'd ripped apart herself, and the white was soaked through, a red bloom in the center, wet and fresh. The glass cut her hand when she tried to block the door, Pearl told later, because she heard the crashing at 2 in the morning, and instead of hiding upstairs, she charged down with a broom and shouted in their faces that she wasn't afraid. And they shoved her. She fell onto the broken glass, and they laughed and left, leaving her there in the wreckage, 62 years old, blood running down her hand. And no one came until she wrapped it herself and made the call. Ellie dropped to her knees beside Pearl and held her. She held her tight, arms around those small trembling shoulders, her face pressed into Pearl's silver hair, and she shook, not from fear. Ellie had stopped being afraid a long time ago, because fear needs hope in order to survive, and she'd grown used to living without hope. She shook with rage so big her body couldn't hold it, and it spilled out through every muscle, every fingertip. And she shook with guilt heavier than anything she'd ever carried, because Pearl Henderson, the 62-year-old woman with hands always dusted in flour, the woman who'd fed her for free on her first day in Ashford, who'd handed her the scrap of paper with the Moreau Mansion address, who'd told her the reason to stay had to be herself, the only person in this world who had looked at Ellie not with pity but with trust. That woman had been hurt because of her. Because of Eloise Crawford. Because of an orphan girl with a burn scar that Sutter wanted to use to strike Beckett, and Pearl had been pulled into the middle only because she'd made the mistake of being kind to the wrong person. The orphanage director's voice came back in Ellie's head, clear and sharp, like a blade cutting through 18 years to reach this exact moment. No one will ever want to keep you, Eloise. But now, sitting on the floor of a wrecked diner with an older woman bleeding in her arms, that sentence twisted into something worse. Something Ellie had never allowed herself to think until this second. It wasn't no one will want to keep you anymore. It was anyone who keeps you will pay for it. Pearl was paying with her diner and a cut on her hand. What would Beckett pay with? What would June pay with? Ellie was a curse. Ellie was the burned bouquet. Ellie was the thing that burned anyone who got too close. Pearl felt Ellie crying because the tears fell hot onto her hair. She lifted her uninjured hand and stroked Ellie's head the way Ellie had stroked little Molly's hair on the step the week before. And she said, weak but still stubborn in the way only Pearl Henderson could be, "This isn't your fault, Ellie." But Ellie didn't hear her. She only heard the crunch of glass under someone's shoes behind her, and she turned, eyes red, cheeks wet, and saw Beckett standing in the doorway. He took in the wreckage, the overturned furniture, the red paint on the wall, Pearl on the floor with her hand wrapped in blood-soaked white cloth, Ellie kneeling beside her, face wet with tears. Ellie watched his eyes go dark, darker than the night of the burned bouquet, darker than she'd ever seen them, dark in a way that told her someone would pay for tonight, and the price would not be small. But Ellie didn't stare at the anger in Beckett's eyes. She stared at Pearl, at the white cloth blooming red, at the wreckage around her, the small diner Pearl had built over a lifetime, the only place in Ashford that had given Ellie a free meal, and never stared at the scar, now broken because of her. And in the silence, among shattered glass and the sharp chemical stench of spray paint and Pearl's heavy breathing, Ellie made a decision. She didn't say it out loud. She didn't look at Beckett when it formed in her mind, clear and sharp and painful. She only held Pearl tighter, closed her eyes, and knew she had to leave, not because of Sutter, not because she was afraid, but because she loved Pearl, loved Beckett, loved June, loved Ashes, loved the mansion with flowers on the table and white curtains in the windows, and because she loved them, she had to go, because staying would turn everyone she loved into a target in a war that wasn't theirs. She opened her eyes, looked around the ruined diner one last time, and knew that tonight, when everyone else was asleep, she would write a letter. They made it back to the mansion near dawn. Beckett brought Pearl into the first-floor sitting room, called his private doctor to dress the cut on her hand properly, and Ellie stayed beside Pearl until she finally drifted off on the sofa, her aged face more deeply lined under the yellow lamplight, the white-wrapped hand resting on her chest. Ellie watched the bandage, watched the streak of blood that had dried into a dark brown stain at the center, and she knew her decision had been made the moment she knelt on the floor of that ruined diner. Only now did she have the courage to admit it to herself. That evening, Dinner happened under a heavy silence. Beckett didn't speak. His eyes stayed dark, his jaw stayed locked. His whole body felt like a bomb counting down. And Ellie knew that somewhere in town, Sutter was counting down too. Franklin moved in and out constantly. Phone to his ear. A whispering voice Ellie didn't try to catch because she didn't need to. She didn't need to know Beckett's plan. She didn't need to know what he would do to Sutter. She only needed to know that Pearl was asleep on the living room sofa with a bandaged hand. And that was all she needed to know what she had to do. Ellie washed the dishes, wiped the table, put the kitchen in order, doing everything the way she always did, slow and careful, as if she were memorizing each motion, each corner of the counter, each grain in the wood, each familiar scratch in the sink she could find, even with her eyes closed. She was saying goodbye to the kitchen without anyone knowing. Beckett went upstairs at 11. Franklin left at 11:30. Pearl slept hard on the first-floor sofa, the pain medication the doctor gave her pulling her into deep sleep. The mansion sank into silence, the thick kind of Montana midnight silence when the pine forest stops whispering and the whole world seems to hold its breath. Ellie sat on the bed in her room, ashes curled beside her thigh, tail looped around her wrist, and she stroked the cat one last time, slowly, from head to tail, feeling the soft vibration of purring under her palm. "Forgive me," she whispered, her voice tight, and Ashes lifted its head to look at her with golden eyes. Not understanding. Not knowing the woman who had saved it in the rain was about to leave. Ellie set Ashes down gently, then opened the closet. The old backpack sat on top of the wardrobe, where she had placed it after the night she almost left, when she heard that rumor on the street corner. She pulled it down, opened it, and began folding her clothes. Not many. She had come to Ashford with almost nothing, and she would leave with the same. 2 outfits, 1 book, a toothbrush. She looked at the oak bookshelf Beckett had built by hand, now filled with library books she'd borrowed from town, and she didn't take a single one from it. She looked at the wool blanket folded on the chair, the blanket he'd left outside her door in those first days and never claimed, and she didn't take it. She wouldn't take anything that belonged to this house, because this house wasn't hers. It had never been hers. She arrived with empty hands, so she would leave with empty hands. At 2 a.m, Ellie went downstairs into the kitchen. She switched on the small lamp over the table, sat in the chair where she had eaten her first dinner with Beckett, and she wrote, paper torn from the small notebook in the kitchen drawer, a ballpoint pen she used to make her weekly shopping lists. Her hand shook so badly the letters slanted, but she wrote anyway, word by word, slowly, because every word had to be right, because these might be the last words she ever gave him. Beckett, I brought trouble to you and to the people I care about. Pearl was hurt because of me. Her diner was destroyed because of me. I can't sit here and wait to see who's next. I can't let it happen again. Thank you for asking me who I am. That's the most beautiful thing anyone has ever done for me. For 27 years, no one asked. You asked. And I'll carry that question with me wherever I go. Please take care of Ashes for me. It likes to sleep on the kitchen windowsill in the late afternoon sun, and it's afraid of thunder. She stopped writing, stared at the paper, wanted to write more, wanted to write that she loved him, that the kiss in the blackout was the most beautiful moment of her life, that the oak bookshelf was a gift she would remember until she died, that the way he said "you're beautiful" was the first time she had ever believed she was. But she didn't write it, because if she wrote it, she wouldn't be able to leave. She signed her name, just one word, Ellie, not Eloise Crawford, not the housekeeper, just Ellie. The name he used when they sat on the porch watching yellow leaves fall, the short, warm name that belonged to a version of her that only existed inside this house. She placed the paper on the kitchen table beside the lavender bouquet she'd replaced the week before. The flowers were still fresh, still pale purple, still sweet in the air. Ellie looked at the bouquet, looked at the letter, looked at the kitchen she had turned from empty cupboards of black coffee and whiskey into a place that smelled like bread every Sunday morning, and she wanted to scream. She put the backpack on, opened the back door, and stepped outside. The Montana night cut at her skin. Dew clung to the grass. The sky was moonless and black. She walked toward the gate, past the security cameras she knew Beckett would review in the morning, down the stone path she had walked the first time months ago, with this same backpack on her shoulder, and nothing in her pocket but enough money for 4 days. The same. Exactly the same as the first day. The old backpack. The dark road. Ellie alone. walking toward the unknown. The Ashford bus stop sat at the end of Main Street. A small tin roof, a long wooden bench, a schedule board so weathered the paint had peeled away until it was nearly unreadable. The first bus ran at 5:15 in the morning. Ellie arrived at 3. She sat on the wooden bench, backpack at her feet, arms wrapped around herself against the cold, and stared at the empty street in front of her. Ashford at 3 in the morning looked like a black and white photograph. No people, no lights, only wind slipping under the awnings of closed shops, and the sound of dry leaves skittering across the road. She looked toward Pearl's diner, far down the street, where the glass would still be broken at this hour, the wall still smeared with red words, and the 62-year-old woman would be sleeping on the Moreau mansion sofa, with her hand wrapped in white cloth. Then Ellie cried. Not the quiet kind of crying she'd done in her room when the rain brought the fire back. Not the restrained kind she'd held back when she told Beckett who she was on the porch. This was real crying, aloud, shaking her shoulders, stealing her breath, bending her over on the bench as she covered her mouth with her hand so the sound wouldn't carry across the empty street. She cried because this time was different from every time before. Every time before, she had been rejected. Neil rejected her. Warren rejected her. Douglas rejected her. The adopting family rejected her. The orphanage rejected her. The whole world rejected her, and she had learned how to live with that. She had learned it so well the scar inside her grew thicker than the scar on her neck. But this time, no one rejected her. Beckett hadn't thrown her out. Pearl hadn't told her to go. June hadn't turned her back. No one had. This time, she was the one rejecting herself. She was the one letting go of the only good thing she had ever had, standing up from the only table where she finally had a seat, walking out of the only house she had finally dared to think of as home. And this bottom was deeper than any bottom she had ever reached, deeper than the night in the orphanage, when she heard the prospective mother whisper that word, that thing, deeper than being fired 3 times for her scar, deeper even than the night she looked into the mirror and wondered if her mother had died to save the wrong child, because in all those other moments, hope had been taken from her by someone else. This time, she was dropping it with her own hands. She sat on the Ashford bus stop bench at 3 in the morning, the old backpack at her feet, tears still coming, and she waited for the bus that would carry her away from the only place where someone had ever asked her who she was. The first bus left Ashford at 5:15 in the morning. Ellie knew because she had stared at the schedule long enough during the 2 hours she waited to memorize every flaking number on the old sign. At 4:45, she stood up. Not because the bus was coming, because she needed to walk, needed to move, needed to do anything other than sit on that freezing wooden bench and cry until there were no tears left. She pulled her backpack onto her shoulders and walked down Ashford's main street in the blue dark of early dawn, with nowhere to go, just walking, her steps heavy on the sidewalk, eyes swollen, nose red, short hair damp against her forehead from the cold dew. She passed the grocery store, past the bakery, past the laundromat where she had found little Molly on the steps, and she kept going to the end of the street where Pearl's diner sat. The diner was still wrecked, the shattered glass covered with a big sheet of cardboard taped in place, the red paint on the wall still smeared and bled, and the silence of the ruins felt like a heavy weight on Ellie's soul. She realized then that she couldn't just run. Running wouldn't fix the glass or erase the hate. Remembering Pearl as a woman stubborn and unbowed, Ellie pushed the broken door open, found the old broom in the corner, and began to sweep the glass herself. As she worked, something inside her shifted. Not slowly, the way she'd slowly fallen in love with Beckett. Not gently, the way she'd slowly begun to think of the mansion as home. This was sudden and sharp, like someone flipping a switch in a dark room and light flooding every corner at once. She looked down at the backpack on her shoulder, that battered old backpack she'd carried every time she was fired, every time she was rejected, every time the world told her she belonged nowhere. The backpack was the symbol of her whole life. Always ready, always packed, always waiting for the moment she'd have to run. And she had run her entire life. Run from the orphanage. Run from cities that didn't have work. Run from Neil, Warren, Douglas. Run to Ashford. And now she was running from Ashford, from Beckett, from the house with flowers on the table and white curtains in the windows, from the man who had asked her who she was. Running. Always running. And Pearl was sweeping. Pearl had been attacked, cut, her diner destroyed, and she was sweeping, not running, sweeping. Ellie looked at Pearl, looked at the backpack, looked at Pearl again. Then she slid the backpack off her shoulder and set it down on the sidewalk, right in front of the diner door, and she knew she wouldn't be on the 5:15 bus. What flared inside her wasn't bravery. Not the bright, heroic kind you read about, the kind that shines and makes you want to shout. This was darker than that, heavier. It was quiet anger. The anger of someone who has been shoved away too many times, backed into corners too many times, told she isn't worth keeping too many times, until one day, instead of crying, instead of running, instead of shrinking and accepting it, she simply stops being afraid. Not because she's fearless, because she's run out of fear to spend. When you've lost everything, given up everything, let go of the last good thing you had with your own hands, there's nothing left to lose. And when there's nothing left to lose, fear loses the reason it exists. Ellie didn't go back to the mansion. She didn't go to the bus stop. She walked 3 blocks, turned left, went 2 more blocks, into the west side of Ashford where the streetlights were fewer, the houses older, the sidewalks more cracked. She knew where Sutter's bar was because Franklin had mentioned it once on a call she had overheard by accident, and because in Ashford everyone knew the Silver Ace sat on the corner of Maple and 4th, a place decent people didn't walk into, and indecent people didn't walk out of before midnight, 6 in the morning. The bar was still open, because a place like this doesn't really close. It just changes what kind of customers it serves. At night, it's drinkers and girls. In the morning, it's the men who come to report and receive orders. Ellie pushed the door and stepped inside. It was dark. The smell of smoke and old liquor soaked into the walls, the seats, the air itself. 2 men at the bar turned to look at her, eyes sweeping her from head to toe, seeing the thin girl, the short hair, the burn scar on her neck, and the backpack on her shoulder that wasn't there, because she'd left it outside Pearl's, and the absence of that backpack now meant more than she expected, because for the first time in her life, Ellie Crawford had walked into a place without carrying a bag to run. Raymond Sutter sat at the back table, a cup of coffee in front of him, a phone in his hand. He looked about 50, broad-faced, small-eyed, the kind of man you wouldn't look twice at on the street, but in a closed room, you'd want to leave immediately. He watched her enter, narrowed his eyes, recognized her, and a slow smile stretched across his mouth. Moreau's scarred little girl, Sutter rasped, amused. Comes in here alone. Does Moreau know you're here? Ellie walked up to his table. She didn't shake. The 2 men at the bar stood, moving closer, but Sutter lifted a hand to stop them, because he was curious. Because a thin girl with a burn scar standing in front of him at 6 in the morning, with eyes swollen from crying, and not a drop of fear on her face, awakened the predator's curiosity more than his instinct to strike. If you want to hurt me, go ahead, Ellie said, her voice calm, low, even, the kind of voice she didn't know she had until this moment. I've got nothing. No family, no money. No one in this world would come looking for my body if you killed me right here. You can hurt me as much as you want. I'm used to being hurt. She paused, and her eyes held Sutter's without blinking, without wavering. And then she continued, but you touched Pearl Henderson, a 62-year-old woman who sells bread and coffee. She has nothing to do with you, nothing to do with Moreau, nothing to do with your war. She was just the only kind person in this town who fed me when I ran out of money, and you smashed her place, cut her hand, left her lying in broken glass at 2 in the morning. Sutter stared at her, the smile thinning, not from fear but from confusion, because he'd met every kind of person in his life, but he hadn't met this kind, a thin, scarred girl standing in front of a mafia boss and not shaking. You want to know who I am? Ellie said, soft and slow. I'm a woman with nothing left to lose. And you know what, Mr. Sutter? A woman with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous woman in the world, because she isn't afraid. Silence settled over the bar. The 2 men at the counter glanced at each other. Sutter stared at Ellie, his small eyes narrowing, and for the first time he didn't see Moreau's scarred girl. He saw something else. Something money can't buy and threats can't manufacture. Ellie turned her back, walked away, straight-backed, shoulders squared, without looking over her shoulder. From Sutter's table to the door was 12 steps, and in those 12 steps, she waited for the scrape of a chair behind her, the rush of footsteps, any sound that said Sutter wouldn't let her leave so easily. But nothing came. Only silence. She pushed the bar door open, stepped into the pale light of dawn, and she didn't shake. She didn't shake. For the first time in 27 years, Ellie Crawford walked through the biggest fear of her life and came out the other side without shaking. It was the bravest moment of her life, not because she wasn't afraid, but because she was afraid down to the bone, and she walked anyway. Behind her, inside the bar, one of the men at the counter pulled out his phone, opened the camera, and recorded the whole thing. Not because Sutter ordered it, but because he didn't believe what he'd just seen either, and he wanted proof that a thin girl with a burn scar had walked into Raymond Sutter's den at 6 a.m, spoken straight to his face, then turned and walked out without shaking. Beckett Moreau woke at 6:15 in the morning and knew instantly that something was wrong. Not because the house was too quiet. The mansion was always quiet at dawn. Because there was no smell of coffee. Since the day Ellie arrived, there hadn't been a single morning he came down the stairs without the faint, living scent of fresh coffee rising from the kitchen into the hall. Today there was nothing. He went downstairs, stepped into the kitchen, and saw the paper on the table beside the lavender, neatly placed, folded in half, the handwriting slanted and unsteady, and he knew before he read it. He knew from the moment the coffee wasn't there. He knew from the moment Ashes stood outside Ellie's door and gave that small, pleading cry, and no one opened. Still, he picked up the paper, unfolded it, and read. Every word. Beckett, I brought trouble to you and to the people I care about. He read it all. He read down to take care of Ashes for me. It likes to sleep on the kitchen windowsill in the late afternoon sun, and it's afraid of thunder. He read down to the signature. Ellie, just one word. And Beckett Moreau, the man all of Ashford bowed to, the man who didn't shake when he faced enemies, who didn't shake when he gave his most brutal orders, who didn't shake when he looked death in the eye, slammed his fist onto the kitchen table so hard the lavender vase jumped and tipped, water spilling across the wood, soaking into the paper, blurring her ink. Franklin rushed into the kitchen, his hand already sliding inside his suit jacket by reflex, and he saw Beckett standing over the table, his fist still planted on the wood, the letter wet under his hand, and on the face of the mafia boss there was something Franklin Doyle, who had followed Beckett for 20 years, through wars and blood and nights that almost ended, had never seen: fear. Beckett Moreau was afraid, not afraid of Sutter, not afraid of someone hurting him, afraid of losing her, afraid she had slipped out the iron gate in the night and vanished into the Montana dark the way she had arrived, without sound, without a trail, leaving only a letter and a stray cat behind. Find her, Beckett said, his voice rough, sharp, trembling at the edges. Now, Franklin drove. Beckett sat in the back seat, and they tore into town under pale gold dawn light. The bus stop was empty. The 5:15 had already gone, and something collapsed in Beckett's chest when he saw the bare wooden bench where she might have sat alone crying through the night. Franklin's phone buzzed. His contacts in the local underworld had flagged a video uploaded to a private forum as a taunt from Sutter's men. Franklin hit play, and Beckett leaned forward over his shoulder, his eyes narrowing as the footage began to roll. The video was shot inside the Silver Ace, gray dim lighting, the angle tilted from the bar, and there, in the frame, Ellie stood in front of Raymond Sutter's table. Beckett stared at her, thin and small, short hair exposing the scar, standing alone in front of a man like that. No one beside her, no weapon, no protection, nothing but swollen eyes that had cried themselves raw, and a voice he couldn't hear because the video had no sound. But he could read her mouth. He could read a woman with nothing left to lose. He could read she isn't afraid. And he watched her turn and walk away, spine straight, shoulders squared, not looking back. 12 steps from Sutter's table to the door, and she didn't shake. Beckett watched it once, then again from the beginning, then a third time, and his expression was something no one could name because it wasn't one feeling. It was 3 layered together: fear because she had walked into the enemy's den alone, and anything could have happened; admiration because the orphan girl, the world had rejected, had done what most men in his world wouldn't dare; and the last layer, the one he had no word for, but it was hot and deep and filled his chest until it hurt, was love. Love down to the bone, love sharp enough to ache. Pearls, Franklin said, because he'd called and learned Ellie was there. They reached the diner in 3 minutes. Beckett opened the car door before Franklin even fully stopped, crossed the sidewalk littered with glass, shoved the cardboard covering the door aside, and stepped in. Ellie was sweeping. She stood alone in the middle of the wreckage, surrounded by overturned chairs and red paint. Her hands blistered, but her movement steady. There was no one else there. Pearl was miles away, resting under the care of Beckett's doctor, but Ellie swept as if she could mend Pearl's broken heart with every stroke of the broom. She didn't look surprised when Beckett walked in, because in her heart, she had known he would find her. Their souls were now woven together so tightly that she could feel his presence before he even stepped through the door, a silent tether that told her she would never have to face the ruins of her life alone again. Ellie looked up at the sound of footsteps and saw Beckett. He stood in the wreckage with his coat thrown on in haste, hair uncombed, eyes red. And he looked at her with eyes she had never seen on him, eyes stripped bare. No ice, no walls, nothing guarding him. Just Beckett, not Mr. Moreau. Just Beckett, a man terrified of losing her. He walked to her, 2 steps, 3, 4, and he pulled her into his arms, hard, in the ruins of Pearl's diner, among shattered glass and overturned tables, in front of Franklin in the doorway, in front of the whole world if the world had been watching. The broom slipped from Ellie's hand and clattered to the floor, and she stood in his embrace with her face against his chest, hearing his heart hammer fast and hard through his shirt, and he said into her hair, rough and breaking and shaking, "Don't ever leave without giving me the chance to keep you." Ellie closed her eyes, tears soaking into his clothes, and she whispered, "I thought I was protecting you." Beckett tightened his arms as if he feared she would vanish the second he loosened. "You think I need protecting?" Ellie lifted her face, eyes wet, lips trembling, and she smiled. A small smile, tired but real, and she said, "I think all of us do." The ruined diner was silent, save for the sound of their breathing and the soft clatter of the fallen broom. Franklin stood as a lone witness in the doorway, turning his gaze toward the empty street to grant them a rare moment of privacy in the midst of the wreckage, his presence a silent guard over their new beginning. Ellie remembered Pearl's wisdom and smiled, thinking of the 62-year-old woman who knew that love sometimes looks like 2 people standing in ruins and choosing not to let go anyway. In the weeks that followed, Beckett dealt with Sutter, not with bullets, not with blood, but with the weapon he understood better than anyone: power. He used information. He used connections. He made phone calls Franklin later told Ellie meant he gave up more than she could imagine. He surrendered part of the West Side territory to other families in exchange for their support to isolate Sutter. He cut supply. He cut transport routes. He cut every artery feeding Sutter's small empire, until Sutter was trapped inside the Silver Ace like a cornered animal. No claws left. No one left at his side. One afternoon, Franklin sat on the mansion porch beside Ellie, looking out at the pine forest, and he said in his steady, even voice, without looking at her, "Do you know what he lost? The West Side territory. 15 years of building. Income down by nearly a third. Another family is stronger now, and the balance of power in Ashford will never be the same." Ellie looked at Franklin and didn't speak, and he went on. "I've followed him for 20 years. He's never given up an inch of ground. To anyone. For any reason." He stood, brushed at his trousers, and before he walked away, he added, still not looking at her, "Until you." Ellie stayed on the porch, watching the pines, and she understood that Beckett Moreau's love wasn't in words. It wasn't in a kiss. It wasn't in an oak bookshelf or a question asked on an autumn porch. His love lived in what he was willing to lose, and he had lost a piece of his empire to keep her safe. That was the clearest proof, the heaviest proof, the costliest proof of love Ellie had ever been given in her life. A month passed, and Ashford changed in the quiet way only people who'd lived there long enough could feel in their bones. Sutter had shrunk back into the West Side, territory carved away, allies pulled off him one by one, and the name Raymond Sutter slowly became something people spoke in the past tense instead of the present. Pearl's diner was repaired, the new glass brighter than the old, the new tables and chairs sturdier than the ones before, and Pearl told Ellie she ought to thank Sutter because, thanks to his little rampage, she finally had an excuse to replace things without her late husband calling her wasteful. Then she laughed, that raspy laugh of a 62-year-old woman who didn't know how to stay down. The Moreau mansion was full of flowers now. Not just the vase of lavender on the dining table, but flowers everywhere, on the windowsills, on the bookshelf in the library, on Beckett's desk where there used to be nothing but paperwork and whiskey, and the back garden, which had been nothing but wild grass and a rotting fence when Ellie first arrived, now bloomed with wildflowers, daisies, lavender, and climbing rose bushes she'd planted along the fence, watering them each morning, talking to them when nobody was watching, because Ellie believed plants could hear, and maybe she was right, because they bloomed more beautifully than any garden in Ashford. Ashes slept on the living room sofa, its leg fully healed, only a slight limp when the air turned cold, and that gray cat had become the closest thing this house had to a soul, padding from room to room like it owned the place, curling in Beckett's lap every night while he read, stretching across Ellie's feet each morning while she kneaded dough, and Franklin was occasionally caught scratching its chin when he thought nobody was looking. That night, Ellie was washing dishes after dinner with her back to the kitchen, and she heard Beckett push back from the table but not head upstairs the way he usually did. He stood in the kitchen doorway, silent, and when she turned he said, "Come with me." She dried her hands on the towel and looked at him, seeing something odd in his eyes. Not worry, not sadness, but something restless, almost uncertain, a kind of nervous energy she'd never seen in Beckett Moreau, a man who made million-dollar decisions without blinking, yet now stood in the doorway of his own kitchen looking like an 18-year-old boy about to ask someone to a dance for the first time. He led her out the back door, down the stone steps, into the garden. It was dark. Montana autumn had shifted fully into early winter, the cold sharp enough to bite, but the garden was still beautiful. Beautiful in a different way. The flowers past their brightest season, yet still dotted with stubborn lavender holding its ground against the chill. And Ellie had strung a small line of lights along the fence the week before, tiny round bulbs casting warm golden glow, turning the garden into a dream someone forgot to wake up from. Beckett brought her to the center of the yard, where the stone bench sat that she used in the afternoons to read, and he stopped. He turned to face her, and Ellie saw him in the soft light, saw the hard planes of his face less severe now because she fed him on time and fed him well, saw the gray eyes she'd once known as steel, now shimmering with something so tender it made her want to cry, saw the broad shoulders she'd leaned into in the wreckage of Pearl's diner, and she realized he was shaking. Beckett Moreau was shaking. Not from the cold. His hands, those big rough hands that had slammed the table when he read her letter, trembled faintly at his sides, and he shoved them into his coat pockets, pulled them out, shoved them back again, as if he were trying to hide something but couldn't find the right moment to offer it. "Ellie," he said, and his voice wasn't the boss's voice. It wasn't Mr. Moreau. It wasn't the voice of the most powerful man in Ashford. It was Beckett. Only Beckett. The voice Genevieve had once answered to. The voice only Ellie heard now. "The day you came to this house, it was an empty shell, 4 walls, a roof, windows, everything in place, and nothing inside. Like a beautiful coffin. No flowers, no curtains, no smell of bread, no laughter, nothing." He paused, swallowed, and Ellie saw his throat move. Saw him trying to control his voice, the way he controlled boardrooms and negotiations, and failing completely, because his voice shook, and he couldn't hide it. "And I was an empty shell too," he went on, softer, like a confession. "I woke up, put on a suit, gave orders, controlled everything, and at night I sat in the library drinking whiskey, staring at my dead wife's photograph, thinking my life would be that, until it ended. I wasn't living. I was just existing. Every day identical to the last, and I couldn't see a reason for tomorrow to be any different." He looked at her, straight on, deep, with eyes she'd watched change, month by month from cold steel into something warmer, brighter, more alive. "Then you came. You brought flowers. You hung curtains. You baked bread on Sundays. You picked up a stray cat in the rain. You sang in the kitchen when you thought no one could hear. You brought life back into this house." His voice broke on the last word, just a flicker, and he caught it again, but Ellie had heard it, and tears rose fast behind her eyes. "You brought life back to me," Beckett said, and it was the hardest sentence he'd ever forced through his own throat. Harder than the night he spoke Genevieve's name in the library, harder than the night he admitted he was afraid he was too broken to love again, because this was the barest truth Beckett Moreau had ever said out loud. He drew his hand from his coat pocket. In his palm was a small black velvet box, and when he opened it, inside was a gold ring. Simple, no diamonds, no stones, just a thin band of gold, glowing softly under the garden lights, and Ellie stared at it through a veil of tears. Beckett tilted the ring in the light, and she saw the engraving on the inside. 3 words: seen, loved, home. 3 words that held everything she'd searched for 27 years. Everything she'd believed she would never have, everything Beckett had given her from the first moment. He looked past the scar and asked who she was. "Eloise Crawford," he said. using her full name. The name she'd hated because it belonged to orphanage files and hospital paperwork. But in his mouth, it sounded different. It sounded like the name of someone cherished. "Will you stay with me?" Ellie cried. Not from pain, not from grief, not from loss or guilt or desperation the way she'd cried every other time in her life. She cried from happiness, the kind of tears she hadn't known she was capable of, because she'd never been happy enough to cry for it. "Yes," she said, choking on the word, one syllable, the shortest answer in the world and the heaviest, because it carried 27 years of loneliness, 3 times being thrown out, the fire when she was 9, the orphanage, the family that walked away, the nights she'd cried alone, the backpack that always waited on top of the wardrobe, and all of it, folded into one, yes, spoken to the man standing in front of her in a garden of flowers, hands shaking, eyes wet, the most feared mafia boss in Ashford trembling for an orphan girl with a burn scar. Beckett took her left hand, lifted the ring, and slid it onto her finger. His hand shook. Ellie felt those big, rough fingers trembling against her skin, trembling so much he had to try twice to ease the band over her knuckle, and she laughed through tears, laughed at the awkwardness, laughed because the man the entire town feared was shaking as he put a ring on his housekeeper's hand, laughed because the world was insane and beautiful, and she was standing right in the middle of it. She looked at the ring on her finger, gold glowing softly in the garden lights, looked up into Beckett's eyes, looked out at the garden she'd planted bloom by bloom with hands the world used to recoil from, on the land of the man the town feared, and she understood, deeper than she'd ever understood anything, that the 3 words inside that ring weren't a promise, they were a fact. She had been seen. She had been loved. And this was home. The wedding took place on a late autumn afternoon at June Moreau's farm, with no fancy invitations, no hundreds of guests, no reporters, and no one there except the people who truly mattered. June had been cleaning the front yard for 3 days. She strung lights along the white wooden fence, set wildflowers in old glass jars on every weathered outdoor table, and she cried at least 7 times while she worked. Each time, she wiped her face and said, "I'm not crying," and then she cried again anyway. Pearl Henderson made the wedding cake, 3 tiers tall, frosted in white, crowned with fresh lavender, and she told Ellie it was the most beautiful cake she'd ever made, more beautiful than her own wedding cake 40 years earlier, because this one was baked with flour and happy tears. She laughed, that familiar rasp in her voice, her left hand healed over but still marked with a pink line where the shard of glass had cut her on the night the cafe was trashed. Franklin Doyle stood as witness, wearing a black suit, posture straight, his face as unreadable as it had been for 20 years. But when Ellie stepped out of June's house, his eyes went red. He turned away, wiped them with the back of his hand, and pretended he was scratching his nose. But no one believed him, not even Beckett. Ellie wore a simple white dress, no long train, no complicated lace, just an off-the-shoulder white dress she'd chosen at a small shop in town, and her left shoulder, where the burn scar ran from beneath her ear down to her collarbone, was fully visible to everyone. For the first time in her life, in front of a crowd, even if that crowd was only June, Pearl, Franklin, and a few trusted people Beckett kept close, Ellie didn't cover it. She didn't hide. She walked across the green grass of the farm, afternoon sunlight falling across the scar, and she didn't lower her head. Beckett stood at the end of the aisle in a black suit, hair neatly combed, and when he saw her, he smiled. Franklin Doyle, standing beside him, the man who'd followed Beckett Moreau through 20 years of darkness and storms, watched that smile and nearly cried a second time, because it was the first real smile he'd seen on Beckett's face in 4 years. Not a polite smile, not a strained one, a true smile. The smile of the boy June said used to run across the farm, hugging cows and climbing trees. The smile that disappeared with Genevieve and now returned on the same face, but deeper, because it carried 4 years of pain and the choice to live again. Inside the small chapel on the farm, there was no pastor, only June reading a blessing in a trembling voice. 2 bouquets arrived from Neil Prescott and Warren Holt with congratulatory cards. Ellie saw their names and felt nothing. No anger, no bitterness, no satisfaction. She simply didn't think about them, because they belonged to the part of her life she'd already walked past, and that part no longer held any power over her. On their wedding night, they sat on the porch of the mansion, the same place where the previous autumn Beckett had asked her who she was, the same place where the yellow leaves had already fallen, and the branches now stood bare, waiting for snow, yet the little string lights still glowed. Ashes lay curled at the foot of the chair, purring in sleep. Ellie rested her head on Beckett's shoulder, the gold ring softly shining on her finger, and she said, her voice light as wind, "I thought there wasn't a place in this world for me. I thought I'd carry that backpack forever, from one city to another, until I was too tired to keep going." Beckett tightened his hold, his fingers lacing through hers, the ring warm between their hands. "I thought I'd never feel anything again. I thought Genevieve took the last living part of me with her when she left. And I accepted that. I accepted living like an empty shell until it ended." Ellie lifted her face to him. "You asked the question no one ever asked. And that was the moment everything changed. But do you know why I love you? Not because you asked, because you listened to the answer." In the months that followed, life in the Moreau mansion moved in a rhythm of peace that neither of them had dared to believe could ever be real for so long. The house filled with flowers in every season, because Ellie learned how to grow blooms that could endure a Montana winter. And even when snow covered the garden in white, inside the windows there were small pots of flowers and the scent of lavender. Ashes slept on the kitchen windowsill every afternoon, in the exact patch of sun that slipped through the white curtains. A gray cat that had once broken its leg in the rain, now round and lazy, and so loved it, forgot it had ever been astray. Beckett woke every morning 10 minutes before Ellie. He made coffee, set her cup on the kitchen table in the place where she always sat, and when she came downstairs, the coffee was still hot. He sat across from her reading the paper, and they ate breakfast together in a comfortable silence, the kind only people who truly love each other can share without needing to fill it with words. Pearl visited every Sunday, bringing new cakes she was experimenting with, and she sat in the mansion's kitchen with Ellie and June for hours, 3 generations of women, an old baker, a mother who grew vegetables, and an orphan girl who had finally found a home, their laughter carrying down the hallway to the study where Beckett worked. He would pause, listen, and smile. One evening, Ellie stood in front of the bathroom mirror, just out of the shower, hair wet, and she looked at her scar. She looked closely, at the wrinkled, discolored line of skin that ran from beneath her left ear down to her shoulder. The thing the world had always seen before it ever saw her. The thing that had gotten her called a monster, driven away, rejected, refused, abandoned. But tonight, for the first time, Ellie looked at the scar and didn't see ugliness. She saw proof. Proof that her mother had saved her. Proof that she had survived the fire, survived the orphanage, survived 18 years of a world that turned its back on her. Proof that she was stronger than any flame, stronger than any rejection, stronger than anyone who had ever said she wasn't worth keeping. That scar was beautiful. Not beautiful because it was pretty, but beautiful because it was the map of the journey she had walked. And that journey ended here, in a mansion with flowers on the table and white curtains on the windows, with a gray cat asleep on the sill, and with a man who made coffee for her every morning. Beckett stepped into the bathroom and stood behind her, watching her through the mirror. And he understood exactly what she was looking at. He laid his hand on her shoulder, right over the scar, warm and light and reverent, the same way he'd touched it for the first time on that autumn night on the porch. Ellie looked at the two of them in the mirror, an orphan girl with a burn scar and a mafia boss with a scar in his heart, 2 broken things that fit together, and she smiled. Eloise Crawford had never been broken. She'd only been waiting for someone wise enough to see her worth. Ellie and Beckett's story isn't only a love story. It's a reminder that every one of us carries scars, some not visible to the eye but always there, and our value doesn't live in those scars. It lives in the person underneath. Sometimes what we need isn't someone who comes to rescue us, but someone patient enough to ask, "Who are you, really?" and to sit down long enough to listen to the answer. If this story touched your heart, please press the like button and share this video with the people you believe need to be reminded that they're worthy of love. Please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss these moving stories each day. And most of all, leave a comment and tell us how you felt after this story. Have you ever felt like you didn't belong anywhere? Have you ever met someone who changed the way you see yourself? Share it, because we always want to hear real stories from the deepest part of your heart. We wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace and happiness. Thank you for staying with us to the end of this story. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.